As the night settles in, so can you. Let us know in the comments, where are you listening this and what is your current time. After that, close your eyes if you like. Nothing we're about to discuss is urgent or even particularly interesting. And let us begin. Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, two names that conjure images of chivalric duels where knights in shining armour clash in the ultimate medieval showdown. In reality, their legendary face-off was less about two guys with swords and more about strategic manoeuvring, political chess, and the occasional supply chain disaster. The Third Crusade, which began in 1189, wasn't exactly a neat affair. It was a sprawling, messy business with real stakes and consequences. Richard, the English king with a penchant for warfare and catchy nicknames, and Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, were the marquee names in this sprawling epic. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Did these two titans of history ever actually meet in single combat? Sorry to spoil the romance, but they didn't. The idea of a one-on-one duel between Richard and Saladin is more fiction than fact, a tale spun by later generations who desperately wanted their history with a side of Hollywood drama. In reality, neither of these leaders was in the habit of risking their necks in personal combat when they had armies to do the dirty work. The myth, however, makes for a good story, one where the stakes are clear, the honour is pure, and the logistics are conveniently ignored. Speaking of logistics, let's talk about the sheer scale of medieval warfare. Richard and his buddies weren't just hopping on horses and galloping into battle. They were moving entire armies, complete with supply trains, siege weapons, and enough provisions to feed thousands of men. Consider this. The supply chain for Richard's army included transporting food, weapons, and basic necessities across Europe, over the Mediterranean, and into the heart of the Holy Land. That's a logistical nightmare that makes modern supply chain issues look like a misplaced Amazon package. And let's not forget the costs. The Third Crusade was a financial sinkhole. To fund his expedition, Richard taxed his subjects to the hilt and famously sold off titles and lands with the tagline, "I would sell London if I could find a buyer." This was no cheap adventure. It was a financial gamble that risked his entire kingdom's economy. In today's money, we're talking millions upon millions of dollars, all to finance a cause that was as much about personal glory as it was about religious duty. But why did these two medieval rock stars never meet in a duel? Quite simply, it wasn't practical. Richard and Saladin were too valuable alive and leading their armies. A duel might have made for a tidy story, but it was the strategic equivalent of a Hail Mary pass in a game where steady plays won championships. Their real conflict was fought through skirmishes, sieges, and negotiations, each leader trying to outmaneuver the other on the grand chessboard of the Crusades. One of the most famous encounters between their forces was the Battle of Arsuf in 1191, where Richard's forces clashed with Saladin's on the plains outside Jaffa. Here, Richard showcased his military prowess, leading a charge that broke Saladin's lines. This wasn't a gentlemanly duel, it was a brutal, sweaty battle that left thousands dead and proved Richard's tactical acumen. Yet even in victory, Richard couldn't secure the ultimate prize, Jerusalem. The city remained firmly in Saladin's hands, a testament to the Sultan's strategic defence and the harsh realities of Crusader politics. Now, let's sprinkle in some myth, busting with a dash of historical reality. Richard and Saladin did exchange letters and gifts, which has been romanticised into tales of mutual respect and chivalry. While it's true they had a certain admiration for each other, these exchanges were as much about diplomacy as they were about respect. Each leader was trying to gain an edge, to outwit the other in a game where words were as powerful as swords. And here's a fun fact, despite their rivalry, Richard never actually saw Saladin on the battlefield. The Sultan was a master of delegation, entrusting his lieutenants to handle the dirty work while he orchestrated the broader strategy. It's the kind of move that would make any modern CEO proud. Let the middle management deal with the details while you focus on the big picture. In the end, the Third Crusade petered out in a series of negotiations and compromises. Richard and Saladin agreed to a truce in 1192, allowing Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem while leaving the city under Muslim control. It was a diplomatic draw, a testament to the fact that even in the age of swords and siege towers, sometimes the pen was mightier. So, While the legend of Richard and Saladin trading blows in a sun-drenched desert might be compelling, the truth is far more interesting. It's a tale of logistics, economics, and politics, where the real battles were fought not with swords, but with strategy and negotiation. A reminder that history, like life, is rarely as simple as it seems. As we leave behind the dusty chessboard of the Crusades, let's fast forward to 14th century France, where courtroom drama got a medieval twist with a side of full-body armour. Enter Sir Jean de Carouges and Jacques Legris, two noblemen embroiled in a scandal that would make a modern soap opera blush. In the year 1386, these two decided that the best way to settle a legal dispute was to try and bash each other's brains out in what history remembers as the last judicial duel sanctioned by the French crown. Now, this wasn't just a couple of knights having a tiff over who gets the last chicken leg at the feast. Oh no, this was a full-blown state-approved slugfest, with King Charles VI giving it the royal thumbs up. The background? A murky mix of land disputes, alleged sexual assault, and good old-fashioned medieval rivalry. You see, Sir Jean de Carouges accused Jacques Legris of raping his wife, Marguerite. In an era where trials were more about who could shout the loudest than hard evidence, the duel was seen as the ultimate truth detector. Because, you know, if you could clobber your opponent, surely God was on your side, right? But before we get into the nitty-gritty of this testosterone-fueled courtroom drama, let's talk about why trial by combat was even a thing. Medieval justice wasn't exactly known for its subtlety or fairness. It was a time when getting justice often involved divine intervention, or at least people hoped it did. The idea was that God would give strength to the righteous, making sure the innocent party came out on top. Picture it as the Middle Ages version of a lie detector test, but with more blood and fewer wires. Of course, this whole system was as flawed as a medieval toothache cure. For starters, it heavily favoured the physically stronger and those better trained in combat. Not exactly a balanced scale of justice, unless you're counting swords as weights. Then is the matter of economics. Equipping oneself for a duel wasn't cheap. We're talking custom-made armour, weapons, and sometimes even horses. It was like a medieval Kickstarter campaign. But instead of funding a new gadget, you were funding your chances of not getting killed. Sir Jean de Carouges, for instance, had to sell parts of his estate to finance his preparations, which tells you just how high the stakes were. Literally, life and land hanging in the balance. So, with wallets drained and tempers flaring, the stage was set for this high-stakes showdown. The duel was to take place in Paris, in front of a crowd that included the king himself, who probably had the medieval equivalent of popcorn ready for the spectacle. This wasn't just a fight. It was the medieval Super Bowl, with the winner taking home not a trophy, but their life and reputation intact. The loser? Well, they'd be too dead to care about legacy. The day of the duel, December 29, 1386, saw Sir Jean and Jacques don their finest armour, each piece clanking with the weight of fate. As they squared off, the atmosphere was electric, charged with the anticipation of the crowd who were eager to see divine justice in action. And here's where the myth gets juicy. This wasn't just a test of strength and skill, but a narrative drama with a tragic heroine, Marguerite, watching from the sidelines. Her fate was tied to her husband's performance. If he lost, her accusation would have been deemed false, and she'd likely face dire consequences. When the fight began, it was brutal, as you might expect when two armoured men swing swords at each other. The duel went through all the stages of medieval combat, from mounted jousting to hand-to-hand combat. The climax? Sir Jean de Carouges managed to unhorse Legris, pinning him to the ground and demanding he confess. Legris refused, maintaining his innocence to the end. With a final, fatal blow, Carouges won both the duel and, according to the rules of the time, the truth. But here's the kicker. Did this brutal spectacle really reveal the truth? Modern historians remain divided. Some suggest Legris might have been innocent, making the duel nothing more than a tragic miscarriage of justice, wrapped in the trappings of chivalry and divine will. Marguerite's testimony, given the societal pressures and lack of evidence, stands as a haunting reminder of the perils faced by women in a male-dominated legal system. This duel was a microcosm of medieval justice, where might often made right and truth was as slippery as a greased eel. The legal system, such as it was, combined superstition with a primitive sense of fairness that often left actual justice out in the cold. The duel between Carouges and Legree may have been the last of its kind, but it highlighted a society on the cusp of change, a world slowly shifting from swords and shields towards courts and contracts. As we leave this tale behind, consider how the idea of divine justice played out in a world where the gods seemed more interested in blood sport than balance. In a time when the scales of justice were tipped by the weight of steel, this duel reminds us of the brutal realities behind the romanticized notions of chivalry and honor. We'll pause here, with Sir Jean de Carouges victorious, but the legacy of this bizarre courtroom drama still echoing through the ages. Keep your armor handy, because medieval history is far from done with its surprises. As we leave behind Sir Jean de Carouges and his medieval courtroom drama, let's hop across the channel to 13th century Scotland, where another epic tale of defiance was brewing. Enter William Wallace, the larger-than-life Scottish hero who, according to legend, single-handedly took on the English Empire with nothing but a claymore and a lot of Scottish grit. Wallace's story is the kind of stuff that makes for blockbuster movies and heart-thumping speeches. But like most tales that have been passed down through centuries, the reality is a bit more mundane. Let's talk about Wallace's claim to fame, the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297. If you're imagining a lone warrior facing off against an endless English horde, you've watched one too many movies. In truth, Wallace's victory was less about gutsy heroics and more about cunning tactics and a rather fortuitous location. Picture this. The English forces, led by John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, had a force of about 9,000 men, including 2,000 cavalry. Wallace, on the other hand, commanded a ragtag band of around 6,000 Scots, mostly infantry. Outnumbered and out-armoured, the Scots needed a game-changer, and the narrow Stirling Bridge was just the ticket. Now, here's the rub. Medieval military strategy wasn't all about swinging swords and shouting war cries. It was about positioning, timing, and sometimes just good old-fashioned luck. Stirling Bridge was a narrow wooden structure, barely wide enough for two horses to cross side by side. Wallace and his co-leader, Andrew Moray, waited patiently as the English, probably smug in their numerical superiority, began to cross in dribs and drabs. Once a significant portion of the English army was on the wrong side of the river, Wallace gave the signal. The Scots charged, cutting off the English cavalry and infantry before they could fully cross. What followed was less a battle and more a grisly massacre, with many English soldiers either hacked down or plunged into the river, weighed down by their armour. Talk about turning the tables. Wallace's victory was a masterpiece of strategic thinking, using the terrain to negate the English advantage in numbers and cavalry. But let's not forget the harsh realities of medieval warfare. The aftermath of Stirling Bridge wasn't just a triumphant cheer for Scottish independence. It was a bloody, muddy affair that left the landscape littered with bodies. The notion of chivalric, noble combat? More like chaos, confusion, and a lot of people losing their footing in the mud. And while Wallace is often depicted as a solo crusader, the truth is, he was far from a one-man army. His success at Stirling was thanks to the collective effort of the Scots who rallied behind him, driven by a shared desire to throw off the English yoke. Wallace himself was a figurehead, a symbol of resistance in a time when morale was as crucial as manpower. His leadership was as much about inspiring his compatriots as it was about tactical brilliance. Let's get into the economics of this medieval rebellion, because, surprise, surprise, wars cost money. The Scots, under Wallace, weren't exactly swimming in resources. They relied heavily on commandeering supplies from the lands they passed through, a practice that was as much about survival as it was about strategy. The English, on the other hand, had the backing of a kingdom's treasury, but even that wasn't endless. The costs of maintaining an army in hostile territory, dealing with supply lines stretched thin over hostile terrain, were astronomical. This wasn't just a battle of swords and shields, it was a battle of coffers and logistics. And here's a tidbit for the number crunchers. The cost of equipping a single English knight could run upwards of 40, a small fortune in the Middle Ages, roughly equivalent to tens of thousands of today's dollars. Meanwhile, Wallace's forces made do with what they could scrounge, a testament to their resourcefulness, if not their fashion sense. The Scots wore whatever armour they could lay hands on, a motley collection that reflected their guerrilla-style warfare, quick, brutal, and undeniably effective when done right. The legend of William Wallace has been burnished by time, turning him into the quintessential underdog hero who faced down the might of an empire. But as with most legends, the truth is a little less glamorous. Wallace wasn't just about fiery speeches and epic battles, he was about pragmatism, leveraging every advantage the Scots could find and never underestimating the power of home field advantage. His story is one of grit and determination for sure. But it's also a reminder that behind every legendary figure is a complex web of strategy, logistics, and a healthy dose of luck. So, while the romantic image of Wallace charging into battle, hair flowing, claymore aloft, is compelling, the real story is one of clever strategy and cold, hard logistics. The Battle of Stirling Bridge wasn't just a fight. It was a tactical masterpiece that upended the traditional rules of engagement. And in the end, it was less about the man and more about the movement. A people's fight against overwhelming odds, written not just in blood, but in the muddy pages of history. As we conclude this chapter of Wallace's tale, remember that history isn't just about the heroes we celebrate, but the everyday reality that made their stories possible. It's about bridge engineering, logistical planning, and the collective struggle of a people fighting for their place in the annals of history. And as we leave Wallace and the Scots behind, let's keep our eyes on the horizon for the next tale of medieval intrigue. There's plenty more where that came from, and I promise the surprises just keep coming. As we leave behind the grit and glory of William Wallace and his band of merry Scots, let's jet set to the 14th century and dive into the world of medieval PR stunts where the combat of the 30 made headlines before headlines were even a thing. This was 1351 Brittany, a place and time where the lines between chivalry and showbiz blurred faster than a medieval artist's brush. Forget about knights riding into battle for noble causes. This was more about flexing biceps and shining armor in a medieval version of reality TV. The backstory? Brittany was embroiled in the War of the Breton Succession, a delightfully messy conflict that was all about who got to wear the crown and wave the scepter. Two claimants were duking it out with a ferocity that could only be rivaled by modern politics. On one side you had John de Montfort, backed by the English, and on the other Charles of Blois, with the French cheering him on. Enter the combat of the 30, a staged battle that was less about military strategy and more about dramatic flair. Picture this. 30 knights from each side, all decked out like medieval action figures, ready to rumble in a cleared field. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill battlefield brawl. It was a carefully orchestrated spectacle with rules, an audience, and undoubtedly someone trying to make a quick buck selling ale to the spectators. The commanders, Robert Bembra for the English side and Jean de Beaumanoir for the French, agreed to this duel as both a show of force and a break in the otherwise tedious siege warfare. Because, let's face it, nothing says, "I'm a better leader," quite like sending your best fighters into a glorified medieval cage match. Now, let's get into the economics of mercenary life, because knights weren't just doing this for glory, they had bills to pay. The life of a medieval mercenary was as glamorous as the bottom of a chamber pot. Sure, they got to wear shiny armor and swing swords, but their pay was erratic. They might be rolling in coin one day and pawning their sword the next. Contracts were often short-term, and loyalty was as fickle as a medieval noble's promise. You went where the gold was gleaming, and if that meant switching sides, well, a knight's got to eat. Here's a number for you. An average knight's retainer fee could range anywhere from £6 to £12 per year, equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars today. Not exactly Scrooge McDuck's money bin, but enough to keep a knight in horseshoes and mead. But don't be fooled. These fees often came with the caveat of providing your own gear, which was costly. A decent suit of armor could set you back a small fortune, and that's without including the upkeep, because nobody wants to face off in rusty chainmail. The combat of the 30 was a perfect PR stunt. It was a chance to showcase the might and valor of each side without the messy business of a full-scale battle. And in a world where news travelled at the speed of a horse's trot, this fight was the medieval version of viral content, a story that would be told and retold, gaining embellishments with each telling. Think of it as medieval marketing genius. The knights were the influencers and the battle was their brand. But let's debunk the romance of chivalry for a moment. While the idea of noble knights fighting for honour is a lovely bedtime story, the reality was less gallant. Sure, knights took oaths of chivalry, but these were as reliable as a medieval map. The truth is, knights were as much about plunder and personal gain as they were about protecting damsels. The combat of the 30 was no different. It was a testosterone-fueled spectacle where the personal stakes were as high as the public spectacle. The fight itself was a brutal affair, with swords clashing and blood spilling, all under the watchful eyes of an eager audience. Jean de Beaumanoir, the French captain, famously shouted for water during the battle, only to be told by an equally parched compatriot to drink his blood. Talk about gallows humour. In the end, after hours of brutal combat, the French emerged victorious, but at a heavy cost. The battlefield was a testament to the chaos and carnage that belied the romanticized notion of chivalric combat. This battle serves as a microcosm of medieval political theatre, where appearances often trumped reality and the optics of a well-fought duel could sway public opinion. It was a reminder that in the medieval world, perception was as powerful as the sword, and sometimes a well-staged battle could achieve more than a full-scale war. So, while the combat of the 30 may not have changed the course of the War of the Breton Succession, it captured the imagination of the time, a tale of valour, blood, and spectacle that would be whispered in hushed tones across Europe's taverns and halls. It was a testament to the power of narrative, where a staged fight could become a symbol of something greater than itself. A cultural touchstone that told a story of courage, loyalty, and the eternal quest for glory. As we leave this tale of chivalric bravado, keep in mind that not all battles were fought with swords and armour. Some were fought with stories and symbols, where the pen or, in this case, the sword dance was mightier than the actual clash. The combat of the 30 was just one chapter in the grand theatre of medieval history, a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles were fought not on the fields, but in the minds of those who heard the tales. Stay tuned, because the world of medieval intrigue has plenty more stories to unveil, where reality often took a backseat to narrative, and the truth was just one version of the story. Speaking of medieval narratives where reality often got lost in translation, we arrive at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, a clash that was as much about Scottish independence as it was about personal vendettas and a touch of medieval bravado. Enter Robert the Bruce and Henry de Bohun, two men whose brief but electrifying encounter on the battlefield added a splash of cinematic drama to an otherwise grueling siege. Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, was no stranger to the rough-and-tumble life of medieval politics. His claim to the throne was a grab bag of cunning alliances, strategic marriages, and yes, the occasional battlefield brawl. By 1314, Bruce was knee-deep in a protracted war of independence against the English crown, a struggle that was as much about identity as it was about autonomy. Now, picture the opening act of the Battle of Bannockburn. The Scots are dug in, ready to defend their homeland, while the English, led by Edward II, are itching for a fight. As the two armies faced off, the sun glaring down like an overzealous stage light, Henry de Bohun, an English knight with a penchant for dramatic entrances, spotted Bruce on the battlefield. And here's where history takes a turn for the theatrical. De Bohun, like any self-respecting knight fueled by glory and a bit too much adrenaline, charged at Bruce, lance in hand, ready to make a name for himself. Bruce, ever the pragmatist and possibly slightly annoyed at having his morning interrupted, sidestepped de Bohun's charge with the agility of a seasoned warrior. In a move that would make any action movie director swoon, Bruce swung his axe with lethal precision, splitting de Bohun's helmet and skull in two. Talk about ending a duel with a bang. This, my friends, is where myths are born. Movies and legends have turned this encounter into the ultimate David versus Goliath moment, but let's unpack the reality bag for a second. De Bohun's death was undoubtedly a morale booster for the Scots, but it wasn't the strategic turning point of the battle. Bannockburn was a complex chess game of tactics, terrain, and troop movements. Bruce's personal victory over de Bohun was a footnote in an epic saga, a reminder that even amidst large-scale warfare, individual acts of valour could capture the imagination. And while we're busy myth-busting, let's talk about the economic and logistical backdrop of Bannockburn. Medieval warfare wasn't just about swinging swords, it was about funding armies, maintaining supply lines, and dealing with the very real costs of war. The English army at Bannockburn was a logistical behemoth, boasting thousands of infantry and cavalry, all needing food, water, and equipment. The cost of keeping such an army on the move was staggering, with the price tag running into thousands of pounds, an astronomical sum at the time. On the flip side, Bruce's forces were the scrappy underdogs, utilising guerrilla tactics, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and a hefty dose of Scottish determination. They relied heavily on local support, which not only boosted supplies but also morale. It was a classic case of quality over quantity, where a well-motivated and strategically positioned force could outmaneuver a larger, more cumbersome opponent. But let's not forget the political chessboard. Bannockburn wasn't just a military victory, it was a political earthquake. Bruce's triumph at Bannockburn solidified his position as King of Scots and dealt a significant blow to English claims over Scotland. The battle became a symbol of Scottish defiance, a rallying cry for independence that echoed through the ages, even as the realities of medieval life were far less romantic. And here's the kicker: despite the personal glory and the political significance, Bruce's axe-wielding moment with de Bohun was a blip on the radar of history. It reminds us that while individual acts of heroism make for great stories, they're often overshadowed by the broader sweep of strategic victories and political gains. Bannockburn was a testament to Bruce's leadership and the resilience of the Scottish people, but it was also a stark reminder that war is as much about numbers and logistics as it is about valour. As we wrap up this tale of medieval daring-do, it's worth pondering how these duels and battles fit into the larger tapestry of history. They're the stories we tell, the legends we craft, the myths we perpetuate. Yet beneath the surface lies a wealth of complexity, a world where economics, politics, and strategy play just as crucial a role as any sword fight. The duel between Bruce and de Bohun offers us a snapshot of the moment where individual bravery intersected with the grind of medieval warfare, highlighting the interplay between myth and reality. So, the next time you hear tales of knights in shining armour or kings swinging axes, remember the layers of history that lie beneath the surface. Behind every legend is a reality shaped by the gritty details of human endeavour, from the economics of war to the politics of power. The stories we tell are as much about the world we live in as the one that came before, a reflection of our enduring fascination with the past and the narratives we choose to carry forward. And there you have it, a journey through medieval history, where the romance of single combat meets the harsh realities of ancient warfare. Whether it's Richard and Saladin's political chess game, Wallace's strategic triumph at Stirling Bridge, or Bruce's split-second decision at Bannockburn, these stories remind us of the intricate web of factors that shape historical events. They're a testament to the enduring power of narrative and the human penchant for turning the past into legend. So, until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, history might be set in stone, but it's far from written in black and white. In the glittering court of the Byzantine Empire, gold wasn't just a metal, it was a statement, a lifestyle, and sometimes a diplomatic weapon. Yes, you heard right, while the rest of the medieval world was busy swinging swords and flinging mud, Byzantium was perfecting the art of looking fabulous. This wasn't just vanity, though, it was strategic. After all, nothing says imperial power. Quite like a gold-encrusted crown that could double as a disco ball. Constantinople, the empire's bedazzled heart, was a city where opulence dripped from every cornice, and even street cats seemed to strut with a regal air. The Byzantines had a unique love affair with gold that began long before their empire was even a twinkle in Rome's eye. But it was during the Byzantine era, roughly from 330 to 1453 AD, that this passion truly reached its zenith. Picture this: gold leaf mosaics shimmering in the Hagia Sophia, icons glistening with the kind of bling that would make even a modern rapper blush, and emperors cloaked in robes so rich they could probably pay off a small country's debt. Now, let's talk numbers, because who doesn't love a good statistic? At its height, the Byzantine Empire stretched over an impressive 1.5 million square miles. That's a lot of territory to impress with your sartorial choices. And impress they did. The Byzantine emperors weren't about to be outdone by their Western counterparts. They sent royal gifts that would put any modern-day swag bag to shame. Gilded chalices, gem-studded crosses, and gold coins so fine they could practically whisper sweet nothings into the velvet-lined ears of visiting dignitaries. But how did they pull off such a golden extravaganza? The secret was in the technique, my friends. Byzantine goldsmiths were the rock stars of their day, the master artisans who took goldsmithing to a whole new level. They used techniques like filigree, granulation, and cloisonné enamel that would make even today's jewelers nod in respect. Imagine threading gold so fine it was like weaving with strands of sunlight, or crafting tiny gold beads, each no bigger than a pinhead, and fusing them to a surface without so much as a soldering iron in sight. These were skills passed down through generations, a closely guarded guild secret that made Byzantine jewelry not just beautiful but also nearly indestructible, perfect for an empire that seemed to last forever. Yet, while the gold sparkled, the reality wasn't always so shiny. The Byzantines were often dealing with a revolving door of invaders who didn't exactly come bearing friendship bracelets. The Goths, the Persians, the Arabs, and later the Seljuk Turks all took their turn at trying to knock down Constantinople's gilded gates. In this high-stakes game of throne, gold was more than mere ornamentation. It was a symbol of stability and power. When the going got tough, the tough got ornamented. Let's not forget the Byzantine obsession with hoarding the stuff. And by hoarding, I mean they treated gold like it was going out of style. Emperor Justinian, thirst Faustinian, I alone was said to have amassed a treasury so vast it would make any dragon's hoard look like pocket change. This wasn't just thriftiness, it was political savvy. Gold was the empire's economic backbone, a currency that could keep the wheels of diplomacy greased and the empire's enemies at bay. Despite the romance of glimmering gold, the reality was that Byzantium's wealth was frequently a shield against its enemies, not just a badge of its success. And here's a nugget of irony for you. While the Byzantines were the ultimate gold aficionados, they rarely minded themselves. The empire was more into outsourcing the dirty work, importing gold from Nubia, the Caucasus, and even further afield. It seems that even in antiquity, the best way to maintain your manicure was to let someone else do the heavy lifting. In essence, the Byzantine Empire's relationship with gold was a complex dance of artistry and strategy, opulence and necessity. They mastered the art of turning gold into a narrative of power, a legacy that still gleams through the annals of history. Whether it was a glittering amulet or a shimmering mosaic, each piece told a story of an empire that, in its prime, sparkled brighter than the sun itself. But don't be fooled by the gleam. Beneath the luster lay a tale as intricate and multifaceted as the gold itself. Now, we've all heard the saying, money makes the world go round. But in Byzantium, it was gold that spun the wheel. And boy did they know how to keep that wheel greased. You see, the Byzantine economy wasn't just about collecting gold like a dragon hoarding treasure. It was more of a high-stakes balancing act where the empire's heart. Constantinople was both the stage and the audience for this dazzling performance. First, let's talk about how the Byzantines managed their gold supply. Spoiler alert, it wasn't as straightforward as you'd think. The empire wasn't exactly bursting with gold mines. Instead, they were the masters of trade acumen, relying heavily on imports from places like Nubia and the Caucasus, a strategic move that ensured their own lands remained pristine and their coffers full. They were like the early adopters of the global supply chain, without the cargo ships or spreadsheets. Instead, think camel caravans and diplomatic negotiations that could rival a modern-day boardroom deal. Speaking of trade, the Byzantines were no strangers to the economic roller coaster that comes with it. Their treasury was more like a yo-yo than a piggy bank. One moment they were rolling in riches, the next they were scrambling to keep the lights on in the Hagia Sophia. This was largely thanks to the empire's rather erratic income streams. Wars, plagues, and those pesky invaders who just wouldn't take a hint all played havoc with the treasury. But the Byzantines were nothing if not resourceful. When the going got tough, they got creative. They had a knack for squeezing gold out of situations that would leave lesser empires in the dust. Enter the Byzantine tax system, a marvel of medieval accounting that ensured the emperor's crown stayed firmly on his head and dripping with gold. Taxes in Byzantium were a bit like an ancient version of crowdfunding. Everyone chipped in, whether they liked it or not, and trust me, they usually didn't. But the empire had ways of making sure everyone paid their dues. Land taxes, poll taxes, even taxes on animals. If it moved, breathed, or grew in the ground, it was probably taxed. This wasn't just about filling the emperor's coffers. It was about maintaining the delicate balance of power and ensuring the empire's continued survival in a volatile world. Now, let's debunk a myth or two. There's a romantic notion that the Byzantine Empire was a land of endless wealth, where gold flowed like water and everyone lived in opulent luxury. But the reality was a bit more gritty. Sure, the elite lived like kings because they were. But for the average Byzantine, life was a constant hustle. Taxes were high, and gold was often in short supply for the everyday citizen. The empire's wealth was concentrated at the top, with the imperial family and the church raking in the lion's share of the riches. What can I say? Some things never change. Despite these challenges, the Byzantines managed to keep their empire afloat for over 1,000 years, a feat that would make any modern nation jealous. They were masters of adaptation, constantly tweaking their economic policies to fit the ever-changing landscape of medieval politics and trade. They knew that gold wasn't just a currency, it was a tool, a weapon, and a symbol of their enduring power. So, the next time you hear someone wax poetic about the glory of Byzantium, remember this. Behind every glittering icon and golden mosaic was an empire that understood the true value of gold, not just as a shiny metal, but as the lifeblood of their civilization. They used it wisely, spent it strategically, and hoarded it relentlessly, ensuring their legacy would sparkle through the ages. And while the romance of Byzantium lies in its golden veneer, the reality is a tale of grit, ingenuity, and sheer economic savvy that continues to fascinate us today. So, as we leave behind the glimmering allure of Byzantine wealth management, let's step into the less dazzling but equally fascinating world of the goldsmiths. These artisans were the unsung heroes behind the empire's dazzling facade, the backstage crew that made sure the Byzantine show sparkled under the spotlight. Forget the emperors and their blingy crowns for a moment. It's time to meet the folks who actually pulled the strings, or in this case the gold threads. First things first, let's talk workshops. Picture a bustling space, not unlike a medieval version of a high-end tech startup, but with fewer beanbag chairs and more anvils. These workshops were the creative heart of Byzantine craftsmanship, where raw gold was transformed into objects of desire that could rival any modern-day luxury brand. Think sleek bracelets, intricate earrings, and chalices that would make your grandma's wedding china look like dollar store fare. Now, if you were to wander into one of these workshops, assuming you'd managed to sweet-talk your way past the foreman, you'd likely find a hive of activity. Apprentices scurrying about like caffeinated ants, craftsmen intently hunched over their workbenches, and the ever-present clinking of metal on metal filling the air. Speaking of apprentices, let's delve into the Byzantine version of vocational training. And by training, I mean a grueling rite of passage that involved more sweat and fewer diplomas than you might expect. You see, becoming a goldsmith wasn't just about having a knack for design or a steady hand. It was about endurance and dedication. Young hopefuls were often recruited into workshops as apprentices, sometimes starting as young as 12 years old. Imagine being a tween, and instead of playing with fidget spinners, you're learning to spin gold like a medieval Rumpelstiltskin. These apprenticeships were no walk in the park. They were a full-on obstacle course, complete with long hours, meticulous tasks, and the occasional grumpy mentor who took the phrase tough love a bit too literally. But, oh, the rewards. For those who survived the Byzantine boot camp of goldsmithing, a world of opportunity awaited. Skilled artisans could command significant respect and, occasionally, a comfortable living. Although, let's be clear, they weren't exactly rolling in gold coins themselves. The real wealth was in their skill, a currency that could pay for a lifetime of honor and, perhaps, the occasional tax break. In the Byzantine social hierarchy, goldsmiths held a unique position. They weren't nobility, but they weren't exactly peasants either. They occupied a sweet spot in the middle, respected for their craft and valued for their contribution to the empire's prestige. Now, let's bust a myth or two. There's a romanticized image of the artist as a lone genius, toiling away in solitude until inspiration strikes. But in Byzantium, goldsmithing was a team sport. It took a village, or at least a small team, to create the masterpieces that graced imperial bodies and church altars. Collaboration was key, and often several artisans would work on a single piece, each bringing their unique expertise to the table. So, the next time you admire a Byzantine relic, remember that it was likely the result of not just one but many skilled hands working in harmony. And what about the influence of these artisans on Byzantine society? Well, Their work was more than just decorative. It was a statement, a testament to the empire's wealth, power, and artistic prowess. Every piece of Byzantine jewelry was a tiny ambassador of the empire's glory, a glittering advertisement for the brilliance of Byzantine culture. In some ways, these artisans were the hidden architects of Byzantium's legacy, crafting a visual language that spoke of an empire that was as beautiful as it was formidable. But here's the kicker. While the artisans were busy crafting masterpieces, the Byzantine Empire was often embroiled in political chaos, religious disputes, and the occasional siege. Talk about working under pressure. Yet, despite the turmoil, the goldsmiths persevered, creating objects that would outlast the very empire they served. It's a testament to the resilience of human creativity, even in the face of uncertainty, a reminder that art often thrives in adversity. As we wrap up this peek into the lives of Byzantine goldsmiths, let's leave a thread hanging for next time. The social dynamics that allowed these artisans to flourish even when the empire itself was on shaky ground. We'll explore how their work influenced not just fashion, but politics and religion, weaving a complex tapestry of influence that extended beyond the workshop walls. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the golden threads of Byzantium's legacy, one gleaming artifact at a time. Let's dive right into the thick of Byzantine goldsmithing, peeling back the layers of opulence to reveal the gritty underbelly of this glittering industry. Sure, the stories of resplendent treasures sound like something out of a fantasy novel, but reality? It was more like a soap opera with a bit of tarnish on the crown. First off, let's tackle the myth that every Byzantine goldsmith lived a life of glam and champagne. The truth is, while some did manage to enjoy a slice of the pie, thanks to royal commissions and church patronage, most were just trying to make ends meet. It wasn't all pearls and silks, rather, it was more about sweat and toil. Economic downturns weren't just a blip on the radar, they were the iceberg that could sink the Titanic of an artisan's career. During lean years, these craftsmen faced the same struggles as any medieval worker, fluctuating demand, material shortages, and the ever-looming threat of political upheaval. Remember the economic roller coaster the Byzantine Empire rode like a medieval theme park? Well, goldsmiths were strapped in right alongside. Take, for example, the 11th century, a time when the empire's economy felt the squeeze thanks to military overextension and dwindling resources. Artisans had to be as versatile as a Swiss army knife, often diversifying their skills to survive. If gold wasn't in vogue due to a depleted treasury or a sudden loss of trade routes, they might pivot to silver or even bronze. It was like being a DJ at a party where the playlist changed with every new guest. And while we're on the subject of changes, let's talk palace intrigue. You see, the Byzantine court was less Downton Abbey and more Game of Thrones with all its backstabbing and power plays. Goldsmiths, being the purveyors of all things shiny, were not immune to these machinations. Sometimes a piece of jewelry was more than a pretty trinket. It was a political statement, a symbol of allegiance, or even a peace offering. Crafting a crown for the wrong faction could land a smith in hot water faster than you can say imperial edict. Speaking of crowns, there's a persistent myth that Byzantine crowns were the stuff of legends, unrivaled in their splendor and dripping with priceless gems. But here's the kicker. Many of these glittering headpieces were more embellishment than reality. Sure, they looked fantastic in mosaics and paintings, but in reality some crowns were crafted from gilded silver or even less precious metals, with glass beads masquerading as rare gems. It was the medieval version of a Hollywood set, glamorous on the outside, but don't look too closely or you might catch a whiff of the plaster and paint. That said, Byzantine goldsmiths were nothing if not masterful illusionists. They knew how to make a little gold go a long way, using techniques like repoussé and chasing to create the illusion of depth and richness. These artisans could take a modest amount of metal and transform it into something that seemed to defy the laws of economics. It's a bit like serving a gourmet meal on a fast food budget, a skill that requires ingenuity, flair, and a touch of daring. But let's not forget the propaganda machine that was the Byzantine Empire. The emperors were well aware that perception was half the battle. Gold wasn't just a commodity, it was a tool of statecraft, a way to project power and stability even when the empire was teetering on the brink. They understood that a well-placed piece of jewelry or a strategically gifted chalice could work wonders in the diplomatic arena. So, It's no surprise that the goldsmiths' work was often swept up in this tide of imperial PR, their creations serving as much as symbols as actual adornments. Despite the challenges, Byzantine goldsmiths managed to leave an indelible mark on history. Their legacy is a testament to the resilience of art and craftsmanship in the face of economic and political turbulence. They were the unsung architects of Byzantium's golden narrative, weaving stories of power and prestige into their creations. So next time you gaze upon a Byzantine relic, remember, beneath the glimmer lies a tale of grit, survival, and a dash of creative genius. As we continue our exploration, let's linger a moment on the social dynamics that allowed these artisans to thrive amidst the chaos. Imagine navigating a world where your craft could elevate or condemn you, depending on the whims of fate and fashion. It wasn't just about creating beautiful objects. It was about understanding the intricate dance of politics, religion, and economy that dictated the Byzantine world. Byzantine goldsmiths were more than mere craftsmen. They were, in a sense, cultural diplomats. Their work bridged the gap between the empire's diverse influences, drawing on Greek, Roman, Persian, and even barbarian styles to create something uniquely Byzantine. This cross-cultural pollination wasn't just a matter of aesthetics. It was a reflection of the empire's position as a crossroads of the ancient world. Goldsmiths had to be culturally savvy, adapting their designs to suit the tastes of emperors, clergy, and wealthy patrons with an eye for the exotic. And let's not underestimate the role of the church in all this. The Byzantine church was a voracious consumer of gold and jewelry, commissioning lavish pieces for religious ceremonies and ecclesiastical decor. These commissions provided a lifeline for many goldsmiths, offering stability in a world where fortunes could change with the stroke of a quill. Of course, this patronage came with strings attached, literal and metaphorical. Artisans had to navigate the complex web of religious symbolism and doctrine, ensuring that their work adhered to the church's strict standards while still showcasing their artistry. Yet, even with these constraints, Byzantine goldsmiths found ways to innovate. They embraced new techniques and materials, pushing the boundaries of what was possible with the tools at their disposal. It was a delicate balancing act, a tightrope walk between tradition and innovation that required both skill and daring. And while not every gambit paid off, those that did left an enduring legacy that continues to captivate us today. As we look ahead to the final chapter of our journey into Byzantine goldsmithing, we'll delve deeper into the enduring influence of these artisans, exploring how their work shaped not only the empire, but also the broader medieval world. From the glittering courts of Constantinople to the far-flung reaches of Europe and the Middle East, the legacy of Byzantine goldsmiths is a testament to the power of art to transcend borders and time. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the golden threads of history, one dazzling artifact at a time. Let's take a closer look at how Byzantine goldsmithing became the gift that kept on giving to the Renaissance and beyond. It's like finding out your grandma's vintage jewelry box is filled with pieces that look fresh off a Milan runway. First off, the Byzantine Empire wasn't just an empire. It was a cultural dynamo, a beacon of light during so-called Dark Ages. While much of Europe was busy keeping warm by setting fire to anything that wasn't nailed down, Byzantium was busy exporting its art and culture like a medieval influencer. Fast forward to the Renaissance. That's right, the so-called rebirth of classical culture owes a pretty penny to our Byzantine friends. When Constantinople fell in 1453, scholars and artists fled west, bringing with them not just their manuscripts, but also the secrets of Byzantine craftsmanship. It was like a cultural explosion in slow motion, with Europe waking up to the fact that there was more to art than pointy cathedrals and stained glass. The Byzantine influence trickled down into the work of Italian masters like Donatello and Ghiberti, who were suddenly all about that intricate metalwork. Let's talk about granulation, one of those Byzantine techniques that made a comeback like bell-bottom jeans. This involves fusing tiny gold beads onto a surface without melting them, a technique that sounds more like sorcery than metallurgy. It was revived during the Renaissance because, let's face it, who doesn't want to show off the kind of bling that screams, "I'm cultured and I know it"? And it wasn't just the Italians who caught the Byzantine bug. Goldsmiths in Germany, France, and even England started to emulate these intricate designs. They were like the medieval version of fanboys, eager to replicate that Byzantine flair in their own workshops. But why stop at the Renaissance? Byzantine art and goldsmithing techniques have been a source of inspiration well into the modern era. Take a stroll through the decorative arts section of any major museum, and you'll see pieces that owe a nod to Byzantine aesthetics. The Victorians, in particular, went gaga for anything that looked remotely Byzantine. They were the original antiquarians, collecting and replicating pieces with a fervour that would make any modern-day collector blush. Now, let's bust a myth about these museum pieces. It's tempting to think that all Byzantine artifacts are exactly as they were back in the day, but the reality is a bit of a tangled web. Many of these pieces have been restored or, dare I say, improved over the centuries. It's like the historical version of a facelift, with a touch-up here and a nip and tuck there. Museums, while preserving these treasures, often don't tell you that what you're seeing might be a Frankenart piece, a little bit original, a little bit restoration. Speaking of museums, the fact that Byzantine artifacts continue to draw crowds speaks volumes. It's not just about the pretty baubles, it's about the stories they tell. These pieces are like time capsules, offering a glimpse into the lives, loves, and losses of a civilization that played a pivotal role in shaping the world as we know it. The Byzantines were masters of narrative, using gold not just to adorn, but to signify. Every piece has a story, a whisper from the past that asks us to listen closely. So, what is it about Byzantine goldsmithing that makes it so enduring? Perhaps it's the combination of artistry and practicality, the way these craftsmen managed to infuse everyday objects with a sense of the divine? Or maybe it's the sheer audacity of it all. The idea that in a world as chaotic as Byzantium's, people still found the time and resources to create objects of breathtaking beauty. It's a testament to the human spirit, the need to create and adorn, even when the world is crumbling around you. As we wrap up this journey through the glittering world of Byzantine goldsmithing, let's reflect on the legacy these artisans left behind. They were more than just craftsmen, they were cultural architects, shaping not just the visual landscape of their own time, but laying the groundwork for generations to come. Their work reminds us that art is not just a reflection of society, but a catalyst for change, a way to reimagine the world and our place in it. So next time you find yourself in front of a Byzantine relic, take a moment to appreciate not just the craftsmanship, but the story behind it. It's a tale of endurance and resilience, of a civilization that understood the value of beauty in a world often defined by chaos. And as you walk away, perhaps you'll carry with you a bit of that Byzantine sparkle, a reminder that sometimes the most enduring legacies are those that shimmer in the margins of history. In a world where the quest for glory often starts at the bottom of a barrel, Hernando de Soto began his life in the backwater town of Jerez de los Caballeros around 1500. You might think that sounds like the perfect setting for a fairy tale, but trust me, his story is anything but. This wasn't your idyllic Spanish countryside. It was more like a place where the air was thick with the smell of ambition and the occasional whiff of manure. Born into a family that was more scraping by than rolling in it, young Hernando had his eyes set on something shinier than the local church altar. Fast forward a couple of decades, and De Soto found himself in the company of Francisco Pizarro, a man who had the charm of a rattlesnake and the patience of one too. Pizarro was prepping for a journey to the New World, a place whispered to be paved with gold and maybe a few less than friendly locals. De Soto, smelling opportunity like a bloodhound, leaped at the chance to join Pizarro on his expedition to the Inca Empire. It was 1532, and the Spanish were about to change the face of South America with a mix of steel, gunpowder, and, let's be honest, sheer audacity. Now, if you're picturing these conquistadors as noble knights on horseback, galloping toward the sunset, you might want to recalibrate your mental image. The conquistadors were more like opportunistic businessmen with swords, their business model: conquest, plunder, and repeat. Hernando de Soto was no exception. He quickly made a name for himself as a shrewd and, at times, ruthless operator in Pizarro's inner circle. His role in the capture of the Inca emperor Atahualpa was a masterclass in opportunism. They convinced Atahualpa to fill a room with gold as ransom, a room that was roughly 22 feet long by 17 feet wide and 8 feet high. Spoiler alert, once the gold was in their hands, the Spaniards executed Atahualpa anyway, because apparently a deal's a deal until it's not. De Soto's share of the loot was enough to make him fabulously wealthy, at least by the standards of the time. We're talking about a haul that could buy you a few castles or, in De Soto's case, fund your own expedition. But wealth wasn't the only thing driving these conquests. There was the allure of titles, land, and the kind of prestige that could elevate a man from humble beginnings to nobility. For De Soto, this was a chance to rewrite his own story, to transform from the son of a minor noble into a legend, or whatever passed for a legend back then. The Spanish crown, ever the pragmatic entity, was more than happy to endorse these adventures. After all, they got a cut of the spoils without having to lift a finger. The economic motivations were clear. The New World was like a glittering treasure chest just waiting to be cracked open. And the political motivations? Well, let's just say that expanding the Empire's influence was a nice bonus. But let's not romanticize these expeditions as gallant quests for glory. The reality was much grimmer. The Spaniards brought with them not just swords and muskets, but also diseases that decimated indigenous populations. They were conquerors, not explorers, driven by a mix of greed and a twisted sense of divine right. De Soto and his compatriots weren't noble adventurers, they were opportunists with a license to pillage. So, there you have it, the early exploits of Hernando de Soto, a man who rose from obscurity to infamy, fueled by ambition and a thirst for gold that rivaled even the most deranged prospector. His story is a testament to the harsh realities of the age of exploration, a time when the world was being carved up by men who saw new lands, not as places to discover, but as opportunities to exploit. And if that doesn't put a damper on the whole romanticized image of the conquistador, then I don't know what will. Stay tuned, because De Soto's story is just getting started, and the next chapter promises even more gold, glory, and probably a few more broken promises. Now, let's fast forward a bit to 1539, a time when Hernando de Soto was no longer just a sidekick in someone else's adventure, but the star of his own show, ready to take on North America. Imagine this, De Soto, fresh off his exploits in South America and armed with a treasure chest fit to make a dragon blush, decided it was time to conquer new lands. But here's the kicker, his expedition wasn't exactly a low-budget indie film, it was more like a blockbuster with a budget that would make even modern Hollywood flinch. With a bankroll that was part gold and a whole lot of IOUs, De Soto assembled a force that would rival any medieval army. We're talking 600 men, 200 horses, and, because every epic needs a twist, around 300 pigs. Yes, pigs. Why pigs, you ask? Well, these weren't just any pigs. They were mobile bacon factories and a vital food source. And let's not forget, pigs breed like, well, pigs. This meant a renewable supply of protein for the long haul. They were also unwitting agents of chaos, spreading diseases that would devastate indigenous populations. But more on that later. De Soto's venture was a logistical nightmare wrapped in an enigma, all tied up with a bow of cultural arrogance. The man borrowed like it was going out of style, securing loans from merchants and friends who probably should have taken a second look at his credit score. He was banking on the idea that the New World was jam-packed with gold, just waiting to be scooped up like seashells on a beach. Spoiler alert, North America wasn't exactly the gold mine De Soto imagined, and his creditors definitely weren't getting postcards with "Wish you were here" written in gold dust. The expedition set sail from Spain with a fleet that was impressive in both size and ambition, landing in what is now Florida. Now, you'd think that after Pizarro's Peruvian escapades, De Soto would have been a bit more cautious about underestimating the local populations. But nope, he doubled down on the old conquistador playbook of arrogance and assumption. The indigenous peoples he encountered were not the passive, gold-laden tribes he'd been dreaming of. Instead, they were complex societies with their own rich cultures and, frankly, their own opinions about uninvited guests. De Soto's approach to diplomacy was about as subtle as a bull in a china shop. His modus operandi involved demanding food, labor, and allegiance from Native American tribes, often resulting in skirmishes that could have been avoided with a little tact and a lot less entitlement. The man's cultural arrogance was so thick you could cut it with a knife that was probably also used to seize whatever he wanted from the locals. And let's talk about those misunderstandings, shall we? De Soto's crew, armed with steel armor and European weaponry, seemed like something out of a nightmare to the indigenous peoples. Imagine seeing these strange armored figures marching through your village, demanding your best food and hospitality, all the while treating you like extras in their grand narrative. It's safe to say that cultural exchanges were less about mutual understanding and more about mutual bewilderment. But it wasn't all conflict and condescension. There were moments of bizarre cooperation and alliances, albeit usually temporary and fraught with tension. De Soto was savvy enough to realize that he needed guides and interpreters, so he often took hostages from one tribe to help him negotiate with the next. His journey through the southeastern United States became a zigzag of battles, alliances, and betrayals. It was a game of chess played on a board where De Soto didn't quite understand the rules, and the pieces kept moving when he wasn't looking. Economically, this expedition was a sinkhole of resources. De Soto's entourage was expensive to maintain, and the costs piled up like poker chips at a high-stakes table. Food and supplies were a constant concern, and the need to sustain such a large group meant relentless pressure on local resources. In the absence of the rumoured gold, the expedition's economic viability relied on pillaging and the occasional trade, creating a cycle of dependency and conflict. The expedition's impact on indigenous societies was catastrophic. European diseases spread like wildfire, decimating populations long before bullets and blades could. The pigs, though seemingly innocuous travel companions, were carriers of diseases to which the indigenous peoples had no immunity. In many ways, these animals were as much a weapon as the conquistadors' swords. This biological warfare was an unintended yet deadly consequence of the expedition, a grim reminder of the price of contact. As De Soto and his men trudged through the swamps and forests of the southeastern United States, the expedition's morale began to wane. Promised riches turned into a grueling march through unfamiliar territory, and the dream of a golden empire faded with each passing mile. The harsh realities of the New World were a far cry from the opulent fantasies spun by the Spanish crown and De Soto's own ambitions. Yet, amid the hardships, De Soto maintained his resolve. He pressed onward, driven by the same determination that had propelled him from obscurity to fame. His gamble was a testament to the era's spirit of exploration, a time when the world was a canvas of unknowns waiting to be painted with European ambition. This venture was as much about ego as it was about empire, a personal quest for legacy in a world where glory was the ultimate currency. So, here we leave Hernando de Soto, not yet at the end of his journey, but firmly entrenched in an adventure that was as much about discovering himself as it was about discovering new lands. His story is a tapestry woven with threads of hope, hubris, and heartbreak, a narrative that defies simple categorization. And as we pause this chapter of his saga, remember, the journey is far from over, and the next leg promises even more twists, turns, and tales worth telling. Stay tuned as De Soto's expedition continues to unravel, revealing the complexities of conquest and the lessons of history in all their messy glory. As Hernando de Soto continued his march through the southeastern United States, the romanticized vision of a land teeming with gold quickly tarnished, revealing a landscape of swamps, dense forests, and a whole lot of angry locals. Picture this: De Soto and his entourage, a ragtag mix of soldiers, slaves, and livestock, trudging through a terrain as unforgiving as his creditors back in Spain. It was 1540, and the expedition was about as far from finding El Dorado as you can get without a map, because, spoiler alert, maps back then were more like vague suggestions than reliable guides. Now, let's talk about those fierce resistances they encountered. The indigenous tribes of the southeastern United States weren't exactly rolling out the red carpet for these Spanish invaders. Why would they? De Soto's crowd came in like uninvited guests at a wedding, demanding the cake and the bride's bouquet. The Muskogee, Choctaw, and other tribes were complex societies with their own political and social structures, not the hapless victims some history books might have you believe. These people stood their ground, often engaging in guerrilla tactics that left De Soto and his men scratching their heads and nursing their wounds. Take the Battle of Mabila, for instance. This wasn't just a minor skirmish, it was a full-blown confrontation that would make even the most seasoned warrior break a sweat. In October 1540, De Soto and his men arrived at the fortified town of Mabila, present-day Alabama, where Chief Tuscaloosa had laid a trap worthy of any Hollywood blockbuster. The ensuing battle was brutal, with the Spaniards eventually claiming victory, but not without paying a steep price. Hundreds of their men were killed or wounded, and the so-called victory left them with little more than a pile of smouldering ruins. The promise of gold? Nowhere to be found. And let's not forget the natural obstacles. If the locals weren't doing enough to deter De Soto's ambitions, Mother Nature certainly was. The expedition faced sweltering heat, relentless mosquitoes, and rivers that seemed determined to drown anyone foolish enough to cross them. De Soto's crew had to rely on their wits and what little provisions they could muster. Remember those pigs? They were becoming less of a mobile buffet and more of a dwindling lifeline. The harsh reality of the new world was setting in, and it was about as welcoming as a brick wall. Economically, the expedition was hemorrhaging resources faster than a leaky boat. De Soto's personal fortune was dwindling, and his men were growing restless. You see, in the absence of gold, the only currency left was the promise of future riches, a currency that doesn't exactly hold up under the weight of an empty stomach. The Spanish crown's investment in this venture was starting to look more like a sunk cost than a shrewd business decision. If this were a modern startup, De Soto would have been ghosting his investors faster than you can say Series A funding. As the expedition pushed further into what is now the Mississippi Valley, the myth of De Soto as a discoverer began to unravel. The man wasn't charting undiscovered lands. He was carving a path through territories well known to the indigenous peoples who had lived there for centuries. The cities of gold he sought were as real as the fountain of youth, a mirage dancing just out of reach. While the Spanish crown might have sold this as a grand adventure, the reality was a relentless grind through a land that offered nothing but hardship and hostility. The diseases that accompanied De Soto's expedition were another grim chapter in this saga. Smallpox, measles, and influenza. These uninvited guests were far more lethal than any sword or musket. The indigenous populations had no immunity to these foreign ailments, leading to devastating outbreaks that decimated entire communities. De Soto and his men might not have intended biological warfare, but their presence was a catalyst for catastrophe. This was a harsh lesson in the unintended consequences of exploration, a dark shadow cast over the romantic notion of discovery. Yet, amid the chaos, De Soto remained undeterred. His ego was as unyielding as the armor he wore, and he pressed onward, convinced that the next horizon would reveal the treasures he sought. But the further he ventured, the more apparent it became that this was a journey without end, a fool's errand, chasing a dream that was never more than a fantasy. Each mile travelled was a testament to the folly of ambition unchecked by reality, and each skirmish a reminder that conquest was a double-edged sword. As the expedition wound its way through the Mississippi River Valley, De Soto's health began to falter. The man who had once stood alongside Pizarro, who had captured emperors and amassed fortunes, was now a shadow of his former self. The journey was taking its toll, both physically and mentally, and the weight of unmet expectations bore down on him like an anchor. But true to form, De Soto's resolve remained unbroken. In his mind, the next great discovery was always just around the corner, even if that corner was as elusive as the cities of gold he'd been chasing. The legacy of Hernando de Soto is a tapestry woven with threads of ambition, greed, and hubris. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense, nor was he a villain without context. The man was a product of his time, driven by the same motivations that fueled the age of exploration, a period when the world was seen not as a collection of diverse cultures, but as a series of resources to be exploited. De Soto's story is a cautionary tale of what happens when ambition blinds reason and success is measured in gold rather than humanity. So, as we leave De Soto and his men trudging through the muddy waters of the Mississippi, remember that history is not just a series of dates and events. It's a reflection of human nature, a mirror held up to the past that shows us the best and worst of ourselves. De Soto's expedition may not have uncovered the riches he sought, but it did reveal the complexities of exploration and the consequences of unchecked ambition. And if that's not a lesson worth learning, then perhaps we're doomed to repeat the mistakes of those who came before us. Stay tuned as we delve further into De Soto's journey, exploring the final chapters of his life and the indelible mark he left on history. The story is far from over, and the next leg of the adventure promises even more revelations, heartbreaks, and perhaps a glimmer of redemption in the unlikeliest of places. The story of Hernando de Soto doesn't end with him galloping triumphantly into the sunset. Instead, it limps toward a conclusion filled with desperation, disease, and demise. By 1542, De Soto's grand expedition had become a tragicomedy of errors. Imagine a man who'd once dined with kings, now reduced to foraging for scraps in the swamps of the Mississippi. The treasure troves he dreamed of were as elusive as a unicorn at a horse show. As De Soto's health deteriorated, so did the morale of his men. His once mighty entourage now resembled a ragged band of survivors from a failed reality show. With resources dwindling and hope hanging by a thread, the expedition had become a textbook case of ambition outpacing reality. The Spaniards had travelled over 4,000 miles through hostile territory, leaving a trail of destruction and disease in their wake. Yet, the only riches they found were in their fevered imaginations. On May 24, 1542, Hernando de Soto died somewhere along the banks of the Mississippi River. The exact location of his death remains as murky as the waters he explored, a fitting end for a man who spent his life chasing shadows. His death was wrapped in secrecy, partly because his men feared how the indigenous peoples might react. They couldn't exactly hold a public funeral without risking a revolt from the locals who were, let's be honest, not exactly mourning the loss of their uninvited guest. Instead, De Soto's body was weighted down with sand and slipped into the Mississippi under the cover of darkness. A burial at sea, well, river, he'd probably never envisioned for himself. This clandestine farewell was a stark contrast to the grand legacy he had hoped to leave behind. The man who dreamed of eternal glory was now a whisper in the annals of history, his final resting place as elusive as the gold he sought. With their leader gone, the expedition was in disarray. Here's a fun fact. When the top dog kicks the bucket, the pack tends to panic. Luis de Moscoso Alvarado took over the reins, and he faced a decision as daunting as a calculus exam after a night out. Continue the mission or head back to civilization. Spoiler alert, they opted for survival. The new plan was to head west, hoping to find a route to Mexico and the safety of Spanish settlements. But plotting a course through the vast and uncharted territories was like trying to find a needle in a haystack with a blindfold on. The fallout from De Soto's death was both immediate and profound. The expedition's morale, already circling the drain, plunged even further. The men were tired, hungry, and haunted by the spectre of failure. The promised land of milk and honey had turned out to be a mirage, and the hard truth hit like a punch to the gut. The economic costs of the expedition were staggering, a black hole of resources that swallowed up fortunes without yielding a single nugget of gold. The human cost was even more devastating. It's estimated that thousands of indigenous people died as a result of the diseases introduced by De Soto and his men. This unintentional biological warfare decimated entire communities, a grim reminder of the dark side of exploration. The expedition's legacy was one of destruction and despair, a far cry from the romanticized visions of conquest and glory. For the remaining members of the expedition, survival became the new priority. Their journey west was fraught with challenges, each day a battle against the elements, exhaustion, and dwindling supplies. The landscape was unforgiving, a relentless adversary that tested their resolve at every turn. By the time they reached the Spanish settlements in Mexico in 1543, they were a shadow of the force that had set out years earlier. Of the original 600 men, fewer than half survived the ordeal. The ultimate failure of De Soto's mission was a harsh lesson in the perils of unchecked ambition. The expedition had been a gamble from the start, a high-stakes bet on the promise of untold riches. But the reality of the New World was far different from the fantasies spun by the Spanish crown. The cities of gold were nothing more than a figment of imagination, a tale told by those who sought to conquer rather than understand. In the grand tapestry of history, De Soto's story is a cautionary tale of dreams undone by hubris. It serves as a reminder that exploration, for all its allure, is fraught with danger and uncertainty. The romanticized image of the fearless explorer is often at odds with the harsh realities they face. De Soto's expedition was a journey into the unknown, driven by a desire for glory that ultimately led to ruin. As we reflect on this chapter of De Soto's saga, it's clear that his story is not just about the pursuit of wealth, but also about the human cost of ambition. The expedition left a lasting impact on the indigenous peoples of North America, a legacy of suffering that cannot be ignored. De Soto's dreams of conquest were built on the backs of those who bore the brunt of his ambition, a sobering truth that casts a long shadow over his legacy. Yet, Even in failure, De Soto's journey is a testament to the indomitable spirit of exploration. It highlights the complexity of human endeavor, the interplay of ambition and folly that defines our history. As we leave De Soto and his men trudging back toward a world that had long since moved on without them, we are left with a story that is both a cautionary tale and a reflection of our own desires. The quest for glory, it seems, is as old as time itself, a pursuit that continues to shape the course of history in ways both profound and perplexing. Stay tuned as we explore the final chapter of Hernando de Soto's legacy, examining the long-term impact of his expedition and the lessons that resonate even today. The story isn't over yet, and the next part promises to delve into the echoes of De Soto's journey that still reverberate through history's corridors. As we dive into the final chapter of Hernando de Soto's saga, it's time to sift through the wreckage of his expedition and figure out what all this means for history's grand narrative. Spoiler alert, it's a mixed bag. Hernando de Soto, the man who chased golden dreams across continents, left behind a legacy that's more tangled than a bowl of spaghetti. On one hand, there's the mythic image of the fearless explorer, the guy who, let's face it, probably had a pair of brass ones to go along with those shiny suits of armor. On the other, there's the grim reality of conquest, a legacy marked by destruction, disease, and the kind of cultural insensitivity that makes you cringe in hindsight. Let's start by peeling back the layers of De Soto's so-called heroism. The traditional narrative, the one that's been fed to us through rose-tinted textbooks, casts him as a gallant adventurer. But hold your horses, literally. De Soto's foray into North America was less about discovery and more about exploitation. His was a mission driven by greed, not glory. The man didn't find the glittering cities of gold he sought, but he did manage to pave the way for further European incursions into indigenous lands. In that sense, he was more of a trailblazer for colonial exploitation than a heroic trailblazer. Now, consider the long-term effects on the indigenous populations. De Soto's expedition was a Pandora's box of horrors, unleashing diseases like smallpox and measles that decimated communities across the southeastern United States. Scholars estimate that these epidemics wiped out as much as 90% of the indigenous population in some areas. Think about that for a second. Imagine entire villages reduced to silence, cultures erased in the blink of an eye. These people weren't just numbers on a ledger. They were vibrant societies with complex traditions suddenly thrust into chaos. It's a legacy that's painful to acknowledge, especially when you realize that De Soto's search for wealth ended up costing so many their future. Economically, the expedition was a spectacular bust. The Spanish crown had hoped for a return on investment that would make any venture capitalist drool, but instead they got an IOU written on the back of a cocktail napkin. De Soto's journey devoured resources like a black hole, yielding nothing but tales of hardship and a body count. The tantalizing idea of a land overflowing with riches was a mirage, a cruel illusion that enticed and then punished those who dared to chase it. The dreams of gold turned into a nightmare of mud and mosquitoes, a cautionary tale for the ages. Politically, the aftermath of De Soto's expedition set the stage for further European encroachment. While he himself failed to establish a foothold, the trails he blazed were later used by other explorers and settlers. His journey offered a rudimentary map of southeastern North America, albeit one etched in blood and sorrow. The Spanish crown, ever the opportunist, shifted focus elsewhere, but the groundwork had been laid. The path of conquest was open, and others would soon follow, armed with the knowledge and mistakes of those who came before. But how does history remember Hernando de Soto? That's the million-dollar question. Or should I say, the million-peso question. The truth is, history often chooses myth over reality, preferring to remember De Soto as a bold adventurer rather than a purveyor of chaos. The romantic allure of exploration is hard to resist, even when the facts stare us in the face like a disappointed parent. There's something irresistibly human about the quest for the unknown, and De Soto's story taps into that primal urge to explore, to conquer, to claim the world as one's own. Yet, it's crucial to look beyond the myth and grapple with the stark realities. De Soto's legacy is a complex tapestry, woven with threads of ambition and tragedy. He was a man of his time, propelled by the same forces that drove the age of exploration, a time when the world was a playground for European powers eager to expand their influence. His story is a mirror reflecting the best and worst of human nature, the drive to explore and the capacity for destruction, the pursuit of glory and the price of hubris. In the end, Hernando de Soto's journey reminds us that history is messy, full of contradictions and uncomfortable truths. It's a tale that forces us to question the narratives we've been told, to dig deeper and uncover the layers of nuance that lie beneath the surface. His legacy is a reminder that exploration is not just about maps and discoveries, but about the lives touched, the cultures encountered, and the impact left behind. So, as we close the book on Hernando de Soto, let's take a moment to reflect on the lessons his story offers. It's a cautionary tale of ambition unchecked by reality, a saga of dreams pursued at the cost of humanity. In remembering de Soto, we remember the countless lives altered by his quest, the indigenous peoples who bore the brunt of his ambition, and the enduring impact of his journey on the tapestry of history. And there you have it, the exploits of Hernando de Soto, a tale as grand as it is grim, a narrative that challenges us to look beyond the myths and confront the truths that lie beneath. It's a story that continues to echo through the corridors of time, a reminder that the past is never as far away as it seems. So, as we bid farewell to this chapter of history, let's carry forward the lessons learned and the stories told, for they are the threads that weave the fabric of our collective past. And if we're lucky, they might just guide us toward a future where exploration is a force for understanding, not exploitation. If you were hanging out on the Mediterranean coastline around 1500 BCE, you might have noticed an unusual amount of hustle and bustle coming from the direction of what we now call Lebanon. This wasn't your average seaside holiday spot, folks. Oh no, this was the stomping ground of the Phoenicians, the OG kings of trade, who were busy setting the stage for one of history's most influential maritime empires. Now, before you start picturing sun-kissed sailors lounging on decks, let's dive into the reality of these ancient traders and their not-so-glamorous yet utterly fascinating world. First off, let's talk geography because, as any good real estate agent will tell you, location is everything. Modern-day Lebanon, where the Phoenicians made their home, offered a prime spot along the Mediterranean with easy access to both the sea and trade routes that snaked inland. It was a narrow strip of land, but it packed a punch, bordered by mountains on one side and the sea on the other. This geography didn't just make for pretty postcards, it was strategic gold. The mountains provided a natural barrier against inland threats, while the coastline served as a launchpad for their legendary ships. Speaking of ships, the Phoenicians were like the Elon Musks of the ancient world, but instead of rockets, they built ships that could make any sailor swoon. Their shipbuilding skills were unparalleled, and let's be real, they had to be. They didn't have the luxury of modern navigational tools or engines. Instead, they relied on the wind, the stars, and some good old-fashioned craftsmanship. And let's not forget their secret weapon, cedar wood. This wasn't just any timber. This was the kind of wood that was so prized that it made its way into royal palaces and temples across the ancient world. The Egyptians, for instance, were fans long before anyone thought to complain about deforestation. With shipyards bustling and cities like Tyre, Sidon and Byblos humming with activity, the Phoenicians weren't just content with local fame. They had bigger fish to fry, or rather, bigger ships to sail. These coastal cities were more than just pretty faces. They were strategically positioned powerhouses. Tyre, for instance, was like the Wall Street of the ancient world, a buzzing hub where deals were made and fortunes were built. Sidon, meanwhile, was famous for its glass production, and Byblos was the go-to place for papyrus, earning it a reputation as a center of writing and record-keeping. But what really kick-started the Phoenician trade engine? Well, besides the aforementioned cedar wood, they had a knack for getting their hands on sought-after goods. We're talking textiles dyed with the famous Tyrian purple, a color so exclusive it made today's designer brands look like clearance sales. This dye came from the murex snail, and producing it was no small feat. Think thousands of snails for just a few grams of dye. It was labor-intensive, smelly work, but the result was worth it. Wearing Tyrian purple was like walking around with a neon sign that said, "I'm rich, here's where we need to bust some myths." The romantic image of Phoenicians as carefree seafarers belies the gritty reality. These traders were more like the venture capitalists of their day, wheeling and dealing, taking risks, and sometimes, let's be real, engaging in less than savory practices. Piracy and slavery occasionally lurked in the shadows of their trade networks, reminding us that their prosperity wasn't built on pure ingenuity and hard work alone. They were savvy, shrewd, and at times ruthless, navigating not just the seas, but also the complex political landscapes of the time. As they sailed across the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians were more than just traders. They were cultural connectors. Their alphabet, a precursor to the one you're reading now, spread like wildfire, influencing languages and writing systems far and wide. It was simple, efficient, and a game-changer for communication. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. That's a story for another day. For now, let's appreciate the Phoenicians for what they were, masters of their maritime domain, with a knack for turning the tides of trade to their advantage. They didn't just set sail, they set the course for entire civilizations. So next time you find yourself marveling at the wonders of ancient commerce or the spread of cultures, spare a thought for those intrepid sailors from the Levant who dared to dream big. They didn't just ride the waves, they made them. Now, let's talk about how the Phoenicians turned the Mediterranean into their personal aquatic playground, and not just for a summer jaunt. We're diving deep into the mechanics of their trade routes, which stretched all the way from the bustling bazaars of the Levant to the windswept shores of the Atlantic. These folks weren't just hugging the coastline like timid swimmers afraid of the deep end, they were trailblazing across vast waters without the luxury of GPS or even a decent map app. First off, let's give a nod to their navigation skills. Imagine a world where you couldn't just ask Siri for directions. The Phoenicians, with nothing but the stars in their wits, managed to cross the Mediterranean like it was their backyard pool. They tracked the position of the sun during the day and the North Star by night, combining this celestial guidance with a keen sense of the sea's rhythm. It's like using the universe's oldest Google Maps, minus the annoying recalculating messages. Their trade routes were the ancient equivalent of a well-oiled logistics machine. Think of it as Amazon Prime, circa 1000 BCE, but instead of drones, you have sturdy ships slicing through the waves. The routes span from Tyre and Sidon across the Mediterranean to Carthage and even as far as the Iberian Peninsula and the British Isles. That's right, the Phoenicians were chilling with Druids long before it was cool. These maritime maestros knew the secret to successful trade wasn't just about getting from point A to point B, it was about making strategic pit stops along the way. They established colonies like Carthage and Gadea, modern-day Cadiz, not just for fun, but as refueling points, both for their ships and their wallets. These outposts became essential hubs, allowing them to restock supplies, trade local goods, and spread their cultural influence like a fine mist of Mediterranean charm. But why stop at just setting up shop along the coast? They were also savvy negotiators, crafting trade agreements and treaties with their more powerful neighbors. Take Egypt, for instance. The Phoenicians had a cozy relationship with the pharaohs, trading luxury items like that famous Tyrian purple dye in exchange for Egyptian grain and gold. It was a symbiotic relationship. Phoenicians got the bling, and Egyptians got to strut around in the ancient world's equivalent of designer couture. Speaking of purple dye, let's break down just how labor-intensive this process was. It involved harvesting murex snails, and by harvesting I mean collecting thousands of them to produce a mere few grams of dye. It was an olfactory assault that made the process smell like a fish market on steroids, but the end result was worth it. The dye was so coveted that it became a status symbol reserved for royalty, and the elite talk about a high-stakes game of fashion. Now, you might be wondering how they kept all this trade running smoothly when there were bigger fish in the sea, like Assyria. The Phoenicians were experts at playing political chess. They knew when to cozy up and when to steer clear. With Assyria, they often paid hefty tributes to ensure peace and uninterrupted trade. It was a classic case of keep your friends close and your powerful frenemies closer. This delicate dance of diplomacy and trade made the Phoenicians masters of their own destiny. They turned adversities into opportunities, leveraging their nimble fleet and sharp negotiating skills to secure trade routes that others could only dream of. These routes weren't just about moving goods. They were about moving ideas, technology, and culture. In the process, they laid the groundwork for what would become the bustling trade networks of the ancient world. As we wrap up this leg of the journey, keep in mind that the Phoenicians weren't just merchants, they were pioneers who set the stage for global trade networks that would shape civilizations for centuries. They navigated not just the seas, but the complex currents of human interaction, proving that sometimes the real treasure isn't what you find at the end of the journey, but what you discover along the way. And with that, we'll leave them sailing into the sunset, their sails full of the winds of change. Figuratively speaking, of course, because we've got more ground to cover in our next installment. Stay tuned, because the Phoenicians are far from done making waves. So, as our Phoenician pals sail off into that metaphorical sunset, let's shift our gaze from the wide open seas to the bustling streets of their city-states. Because trust me, the real action wasn't just happening on the water. It was right there in the heart of cities like Tyre, Sidon and Byblos, where the gears of trade were grinding away, fueled by a social and political system as intricate as a Phoenician knot. Now, let's bust a myth right off the bat. The Phoenicians weren't an empire like the Romans or the Persians. They didn't have a singular ruler or a centralized government issuing decrees from a gilded throne. Nope, these folks were more like a loosely organized fraternity of city-states, each with its own flavor and flair. Think of them less as a united empire, and more like a network of savvy entrepreneurs who occasionally met for a potluck to swap trade secrets. Each city-state was its own powerhouse, run by a king who was less of a monarch and more of a CEO. These kings had a knack for diplomacy and commerce, a necessary skill when your neighbors included the likes of Assyria and Egypt. And while it's tempting to picture these kings as benevolent leaders, let's not forget that their crowns were often bought with trade revenues and secured with a healthy dose of political maneuvering. In other words, they were as much about the boardroom as the throne room. The real muscle behind these city-states, however, was the merchant class. These were the families that had their hands in every trade deal, and their pockets lined with the profits. They were the ancient equivalent of venture capitalists, investing in ships, goods, and even other merchants. It's not a stretch to say that the rich merchants of Phoenicia were the ones pulling the strings, with the kings acting as figureheads who were smart enough to keep their best clients happy. But let's not paint too rosy a picture here. The Phoenician society was a complex web of hierarchies. At the top were the merchant families, rolling in wealth and influence. Then came the skilled artisans and craftsmen, the backbone of the economy with their glass-blowing and textile skills. Below them, you had the labourers and, at the very bottom, the slaves, because yes, even in this bustling trade utopia, slavery was a grim reality. It was a pyramid scheme quite literally, with wealth trickling upwards and labourers doing the heavy lifting. Trade was the lifeblood of these city-states, and it didn't just fill their coffers, it shaped their very identity. The wealth generated from trade influenced everything from the architecture to the arts, with grand temples and palaces rising from the profits of far-flung trade routes. And let's not forget the cultural exchanges that happened as a result. The Phoenicians were like cultural sponges, absorbing influences from their trading partners and infusing them into their own society. This cultural cross-pollination was as valuable as any cargo of gold or silver. One of the most intriguing aspects of Phoenician society was their legal system, which was as pragmatic as you'd expect from a bunch of traders. Contracts were king, with everything from trade deals to marriage agreements meticulously documented. They understood the power of the written word, and with their alphabet, one of their most famous exports, they ensured that records were clear, disputes were minimized, and business flowed smoothly. It was bureaucracy, but with a distinctly Phoenician twist. And while we're setting the record straight, let's talk about the notion of Phoenician unity. The idea of them being a cohesive empire is more myth than reality. Sure, they shared a language and a penchant for trade, but each city-state was fiercely independent. They were like siblings who occasionally borrowed each other's clothes but didn't necessarily get along. Their unity was practical, not political. They banded together when it made economic sense, but when push came to shove, they looked out for number one. This independence was both a strength and a weakness. It allowed them to be nimble, adapting to changing markets and political landscapes, but it also meant that when larger threats loomed, like the Assyrians expanding their empire, the Phoenicians didn't have a united front. Instead, they relied on diplomacy, tribute, and sometimes a bit of good old-fashioned bribery to keep the peace. It was the art of survival, Phoenician style. So, as we wrap up this glimpse into the internal workings of Phoenician society, let's appreciate the delicate balancing act they performed. They weren't just traders, they were masters of adaptation, leveraging their societal structure to thrive in a world that was as unpredictable as the Mediterranean Sea. Their legacy isn't just in the goods they traded or the colonies they established, it's in the way they navigated the complexities of human society, proving that sometimes the real art of trade is knowing how to deal with people. And with that, we leave our Phoenician friends to their bustling city-states, ready to tackle the next challenge the ancient world throws their way. But don't pack up your curiosity just yet. There's more to explore on this ancient adventure. Stay tuned. And speaking of evolution, let's talk about one of the Phoenicians' most enduring legacies, their alphabet. Yes, folks, these ancient merchants weren't just playing with boats, they were playing with letters too. We're talking about a culture that took the cumbersome business of writing and turned it into something as streamlined as their ships. Picture this. Around 1050 BCE, the Phoenicians devised a writing system that was as nimble and efficient as a Tyrian trade vessel. It had just 22 characters, all consonants, which might sound like a Scrabble player's nightmare, but it was actually a linguistic revolution. Before you roll your eyes at yet another alphabet story, consider this. The Phoenician alphabet was the granddaddy of the Greek and Latin scripts. That's right, those squiggly markings you see in ancient Greek temples and Roman inscriptions. They owe a debt to the Phoenicians. This wasn't just a local phenomenon, it was the kind of cultural exchange that makes the Silk Road look like a sidewalk sale. The Greeks took a look at this alphabet, added vowels, because they fancied their words with a bit more flair, and voila, the foundation for Western literacy was laid. Now, why did this alphabet catch on like a catchy pop song? Simple. It was practical. Compared to the complex cuneiform of Mesopotamia or the elaborate hieroglyphics of Egypt, the Phoenician script was easy to learn and reproduce. It was the ancient world's answer to user-friendly tech. Traders from different cultures could pick it up quickly, and before you knew it, this script was the lingua franca of the Mediterranean trade routes. It was like discovering the Rosetta Stone, but in reverse. Everyone suddenly had a common language to work with. But here's the kicker. While the Phoenicians were spreading their alphabet far and wide, they weren't exactly playing the role of selfless cultural ambassadors. Sure, they shared their writing system, but it was more about making business smoother than about cultural enlightenment. The Phoenician alphabet spread not because they were trying to educate the masses, but because it oiled the wheels of commerce. It was the ultimate business tool, not a philanthropic endeavor. In essence, they were the ancient world's equivalent of a tech startup whose product just happened to go viral. Moving on from alphabets, let's dig into the cultural potluck that was Phoenician trade. Their bustling ports and colonies became melting pots of ideas where art, religion, and technology were exchanged with the same fervor as goods and spices. Take Carthage, for example. This Phoenician colony didn't just trade in silver and gold, it traded in culture. As traders and settlers mingled, they swapped more than just currency. They shared stories, beliefs, and artistic techniques. In the realm of art, the Phoenicians were like sponges, absorbing influences from Egypt, Greece, and Mesopotamia, and then wringing them out in their own distinctive style. You'd find Egyptian motifs rubbing shoulders with Greek designs and Phoenician jewelry, and Mesopotamian statuary techniques being used to create local deities. This eclectic mix was less about originality and more about adaptability. The Phoenicians knew a good thing when they saw it, and they weren't shy about borrowing or outright stealing what worked. Religion, too, was a hotbed of exchange. The Phoenicians worshipped a pantheon of gods, with Baal and Astarte leading the charge. But they weren't dogmatic about it. If a neighboring culture had a deity that seemed particularly powerful or useful, the Phoenicians would happily incorporate it into their own religious practices. It was divine diplomacy at its finest. Why fight over gods when you can just add them to your collection? Now, let's take a moment to scrutinize the romantic notion of the Phoenicians as altruistic spreaders of culture. It's tempting to picture them as benevolent traders, spreading the light of knowledge and art wherever they went. But, let's be real, the Phoenicians were pragmatists first and foremost. Their cultural exchanges were driven by necessity and opportunity rather than a grand vision of cultural unity. They shared what they had to for trade to flourish, and if art and religion happened to hitch a ride, well, that was just a bonus. Trading hubs like Tyre and Sidon weren't just places where goods changed hands, they were where ideas found new homes. These cities were the ancient equivalent of Silicon Valley, buzzing with innovation and ambition. They were places where a Greek philosopher might bump into an Egyptian merchant, sparking a conversation that could lead to new ideas in philosophy or science. It was a vibrant, chaotic mix of cultures, and while it wasn't always peaceful, it was undeniably productive. But let's not delude ourselves into thinking every interaction was harmonious. The melting pot of cultures could just as easily lead to clashes as to collaboration. Competition was fierce, and while the Phoenicians mastered the art of diplomacy, they also knew when to wield power. Sometimes, cultural exchanges were less about sharing and more about imposing. The Phoenicians were adept at using their influence to shape the cultures they traded with, ensuring that they remained at the top of the economic and cultural food chain. So, as we navigate through this intricate web of cultural exchange, let's remember that the Phoenicians weren't just spreading the seeds of civilization. They were planting them strategically to ensure their own growth. Their legacy isn't just the spread of an alphabet or the influence on art and religion. It's the creation of a world where ideas could travel as freely as goods, laying the groundwork for the interconnected societies that would follow. And with that, we're ready to dive even deeper into the Phoenician saga in our next installment. Stay curious, because there's more to come in this ancient tale of trade, culture, and the relentless pursuit of opportunity. As we sail into the sunset of our Phoenician saga, let's pivot from their nautical triumphs to the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. It wasn't all smooth sailing for our maritime mavericks, and as history often teaches us, every empire, no matter how savvy, eventually meets its match. By the time the calendar flipped to the 6th century BCE, the Phoenicians were staring down some serious competition. Enter the Greeks and Romans, the new kids on the Mediterranean bloc, who weren't content to let the Phoenicians have all the fun or the profits. Now, the Greeks were no strangers to the sea. They took to it like ducks to water, or in this case, like sailors to a well-stocked cargo ship. While the Phoenicians had been sailing around with their alphabet and purple dye, the Greeks were busy perfecting their own brand of maritime excellence. They brought to the table not just competitive shipping, but also a vibrant culture that rivaled the Phoenicians' own. By the time Alexander the Great was doing his thing in the 4th century BCE, Greek culture was spreading faster than a rumour at a royal court. But it wasn't just Greek innovation that was rocking the Phoenician boat. Let's not forget Rome, which started out as a scrappy city-state and turned into a juggernaut. By the 3rd century BCE, the Romans were flexing their muscles across the Mediterranean like they were in some ancient bodybuilding contest, and the Phoenicians found themselves in the way. Carthage, the Phoenician jewel in the crown, bore the brunt of this newfound Roman ambition. What followed was the Punic Wars, a series of conflicts that were as brutal as they were decisive. Over the course of the 3rd and centuries BCE, these wars saw Carthage, and by extension the Phoenician network, pummeled into submission. The Romans weren't just about military might, though. They were shrewd economic strategists. While the Phoenicians had been content to dominate trade through naval prowess and clever alliances, the Romans went a step further. They systematized trade, creating infrastructure that made the Mediterranean as efficient as a Roman aqueduct. Roads, harbours, and a currency system that put Phoenician barter to shame. Rome was playing 4D chess while the Phoenicians were still figuring out checkers. By the time the dust settled, the Phoenician trade network had been absorbed into the burgeoning Roman Empire, their ships and routes commandeered for Roman glory. So, what happened to the Phoenicians amidst this shifting power dynamic? Well, they didn't just pack up their jars of purple dye and call it a day. While their political power waned, their cultural and economic influence lingered, like the aroma of cedarwood long after the last tree has been felled. Their alphabet, that ingenious string of consonants, continued to underpin the writing systems of Greece and Rome, and by extension, much of Western civilization. They may not have been sitting on thrones, but their legacy was etched into stone, literally. Now, let's take a moment to debunk the grandiose myths that often shroud the Phoenicians in a romantic haze. Were they the sole inventors of the alphabet? The progenitors of all Western trade? The unchallenged masters of the seas? Not quite. They were a critical link in the chain of history, but not the only one. Their alphabet was a significant development, but it was built on existing scripts. Their trade networks were vast, but they were just one part of a complex Mediterranean economy. They were brilliant, but they were also opportunistic. riding the waves of fortune until those waves inevitably crashed on the shores of Roman ambition. So, what can we learn from the fall of the Phoenician trade networks? It's a classic tale of economic power and cultural influence, a narrative as old as time itself. The rise of new powers, the relentless march of innovation, and the shifting sands of political allegiances all played a part in their decline. Yet, their story is not just a cautionary tale of downfall. It's a testament to the enduring power of cultural exchange and economic ingenuity. The Phoenicians remind us that while empires may crumble, the ideas and innovations they leave behind can transcend even the most definitive of defeats. In the end, the Phoenicians were more than just traders, they were trailblazers. They charted new courses, both literal and metaphorical, and in doing so, they laid the groundwork for the interconnected world we find ourselves in today. Their legacy is a reminder that in the grand tapestry of history, it's not just the kings and conquerors who matter, but also the merchants and mariners, the innovators and influencers. They didn't just ride the tides of history, they helped shape them. So, as we wrap up our journey through the world of the Phoenicians, let's remember them not as mere footnotes in the annals of history, but as navigators of an ancient world that was every bit as dynamic and complex as our own. They were the original globalists, weaving a web of connections that would stretch far beyond their own shores. And in doing so, they left an indelible mark on the world, proving that sometimes the most profound legacies are those carried not by armies, but by the winds of trade. In the chaos of early 17th century France, where political intrigue was practically an Olympic sport, a young Armand Jean Duplessis was busy dodging childhood illnesses like a champ. You might know him better as Cardinal Richelieu, the man who could probably win a gold medal in the art of political manoeuvring. Born in 1585, Richelieu came into a world that made Game of Thrones look like a stroll in the park. He was the fifth of 6 children in a noble family, which meant he was hardly the heir to any family fortune. Instead, he was destined for the church, largely because the family estate needed someone to keep the faith, quite literally. Now, if you're imagining little Richelieu as a sickly kid wrapped in blankets, you're not far off. He was plagued by migraines and a weak constitution which, let's be honest, wasn't the best start for a future power player. Yet, it was precisely this frail beginning that laid the groundwork for his mighty intellect. He was sent to the College of Navarre in Paris, a move that would have cost a pretty penny, but was absolutely worth it. The college was a breeding ground for future statesmen, and here Richelieu honed his skills in diplomacy, theology, and, crucially, the art of persuasion. By 21, our young ecclesiastical prodigy was appointed Bishop of Luçon, a position usually reserved for more seasoned clergy. But hey, when your family has connections and your predecessor conveniently dies, doors open. Here, Richelieu showed his first real flair for diplomacy, managing to calm the religious tensions in his diocese with the finesse of someone much older. He was already flexing his talent for balancing acts between conflicting interests, a skill that would become his trademark. However, it's not all smooth sailing to the top. France, at this point, was a patchwork of fiefdoms, each with its noble family itching for a fight. The Catholic Church was no less a battlefield, with various factions vying for influence over the crown. Richelieu needed to be more than a decent bishop, he had to be a political chameleon, and, boy, did he rise to the occasion. By 1606, after some deft moves and securing the favour of Marie de Medici, the Queen Mother, he snagged the title of Secretary of State. Not too shabby for a guy who had once been considered too sickly to survive a harsh winter. His early political career was a masterclass in the art of survival. Richelieu knew that in the cutthroat world of French politics, you either swam with the sharks or got eaten alive. He was swimming, all right, and quickly becoming the most cunning fish in the pond. The socio-political landscape of France was messy, to put it mildly. The country was still reeling from the wars of religion, which had ended in 1598 with the Edict of Nantes, granting some degree of religious tolerance to the Huguenots. But peace was as fragile as a porcelain vase in a bullfight, and Richelieu understood that stability was the key to power. Richelieu's rise within the church was not just about personal ambition, it was a strategic move to consolidate influence. The church was more than a spiritual institution, it was a powerhouse of political clout. Richelieu manoeuvred through its ranks with all the agility of a chess grandmaster, knowing full well that ecclesiastical power was a direct line to political authority. His knack for diplomacy and his unwavering loyalty to the crown made him indispensable. He understood that to wield real power, he needed to be at the epicenter of politics, and the church was his ticket there. In a world where noble titles were handed out like party favors to the well-connected, Richelieu was a refreshing anomaly. He earned his way up, not just by birthright, but through sheer political acumen. His story is a testament to the fact that sometimes it's the underdog with a penchant for strategy who ends up on top. As he ascended to the role as Secretary of State, Richelieu was already laying the groundwork for his future as the de facto ruler of France. He was just getting started, and his next moves would reshape the kingdom in ways few could have anticipated. Richelieu, having secured his position as Secretary of State, was like a chess grandmaster preparing for a high-stakes match. Only, instead of pawns and knights, he had nobles and Huguenots to contend with. His ascent to the role of the king's chief minister in 1624 was the ultimate power move. Think of it as securing the queen on the board. Now, with Louis XIII as his king, Richelieu had the opportunity to reshape France with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. One of Richelieu's first acts of political surgery was the siege of La Rochelle, a conflict that was less about military might and more about making a statement. La Rochelle was a stronghold of Protestant Huguenots, and Richelieu was keen on reining in their autonomy. The siege, which kicked off in 1627, was a logistical nightmare that would have sent lesser men running for cover. Richelieu, however, was unflappable. He orchestrated the construction of a massive seawall, known as the Digue de Richelieu, to blockade the port and starve the city into submission. This wasn't just a casual DIY project. The wall stretched nearly 1,400 meters and cost a staggering 1.5 million livres, an amount that could have bought you a small kingdom back then. The economic context here is crucial. France was not exactly swimming in cash, but Richelieu justified the expense as necessary for the greater good. He understood that controlling La Rochelle was key to centralizing power in France, much like a modern CEO streamlining operations. The siege lasted over a year, finally ending in 1628 with the city's surrender. For the Huguenots, it was a bitter defeat, but for Richelieu, it was a masterstroke. He had effectively demonstrated that the crown would not tolerate any challenge to its authority, religious or otherwise. Now, let's talk about Richelieu's not-so-secret obsession with curbing the power of the nobility. The French aristocracy of the time was a bit like a high school clique, exclusive, powerful, and prone to drama. They held significant sway over the regions, and Richelieu was having none of it. He was determined to bring them to heel, ensuring that their loyalty was to the crown and not their own ambitions. This was no small feat, akin to convincing a herd of cats to march in formation. Richelieu's strategy involved a mix of carrot and stick. He created the position of intendant, essentially regional governors who reported directly to him, bypassing the traditional noble power structures. Think of it as setting up a network of spies who also happened to run the show. The nobility, unsurprisingly, bristled at this encroachment on their territory, but Richelieu was relentless. He even had a few rebellious nobles executed for treason, sending a clear message that he was not a man to be trifled with. Of course, with power comes the inevitable myth-making, and Richelieu was cast as the quintessential villain in the eyes of many. His penchant for centralization and iron-fisted control earned him the moniker of Red Eminence, a nod to his cardinal's robes and, perhaps, his perceived ruthlessness. But was he really the moustache-twirling antagonist of 17th-century France, or just a pragmatic leader in a tumultuous time? The truth, as always, is a bit more nuanced. Sure, Richelieu was no saint. He had little patience for dissent, and his methods could be brutal. But he was also a man who understood the importance of a strong, unified state. In an era when France was a patchwork quilt of competing interests, Richelieu was the needle that stitched it all together. His policies, while often heavy-handed, were instrumental in laying the groundwork for the modern French state. It's easy to paint Richelieu as a villain when you're standing on the moral high ground of the 21st century, sipping your ethically sourced coffee. But let's not forget the messy realities of his time. France was teetering on the brink of chaos, with religious wars and noble uprisings threatening to tear it apart. Richelieu's centralization efforts were not just about power for power's sake, they were about survival. In the grand tapestry of history, Richelieu is one of those figures who defies simple categorization. He was neither hero nor villain, but something more complex, a man who used every tool at his disposal to stabilize a country in turmoil. As he tightened his grip on the French state, Richelieu was laying the foundations for the rise of absolute monarchy, a legacy that would reach its zenith with Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Richelieu's story is far from over. With his domestic policies in place, he turned his attention to the international stage, where new challenges awaited. France, after all, was not an island unto itself, and Richelieu was all too aware of the delicate balance of power in Europe. Stay tuned as we venture next into his foreign policy maneuvers and the intricate dance of diplomacy that would define the latter part of his career. As Richelieu shifted his gaze from the domestic chessboard to the international arena, he wasn't merely rearranging pawns, he was playing a high-stakes game of three-dimensional diplomatic chess. Europe, in the early 17th century, was a jigsaw puzzle of conflicting interests, and Richelieu was determined to ensure that France had the most significant piece on the board. The 30 Years' War, that brutal mix of religious fervour and political power plays, was raging like a particularly unruly bonfire. Now, let's get one thing straight. This wasn't a war for the faint of heart or weak of wallet. Think of it as the early modern version of a blockbuster sequel. Expensive, explosive, and full of unexpected twists. Richelieu's entry into this chaotic theatre was not purely out of altruism or an overzealous desire to spread Catholicism. No, our Cardinal's motives were as pragmatic as they come. France, nestled between the Habsburg territories in Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, was feeling the squeeze. The Habsburgs, with their sprawling empire and high ambitions, were like the Walmart of European power, expansive and everywhere. Richelieu knew that if France were to stand tall, it needed to curb the Habsburg influence without plunging the country into economic ruin. Enter the Franco-Dutch alliance, in a move that could be described as "the enemy of my enemy is my friend." Richelieu extended a diplomatic hand to the Protestant Dutch Republic. Cue gasps from the gallery. A Catholic cardinal aligning with Protestants? Scandalous. Yet, Richelieu wasn't about to let a little thing like religious difference get in the way of political pragmatism. This alliance was all about counterbalancing Habsburg power, and the Dutch, with their formidable trading networks and naval prowess, were just the partners France needed. The treaty, signed in 1635, was a masterstroke of diplomacy, illustrating Richelieu's skill at turning potential rivals into valuable allies. Now, diplomacy isn't just about signing treaties and shaking hands. It's also about making sure the coffers are well stocked. War is expensive, and the 30 Years' War was no exception. Richelieu, ever the economic wizard, understood this all too well. He implemented a series of financial reforms designed to bolster France's war chest. Taxation was tightened and the revenue from the intendants, those regional watchdogs he so cleverly installed, was funneled directly into the war effort. It was like siphoning funds from 1,000 little piggy banks scattered across the kingdom, and while this kept the war machine running, it didn't exactly win him any popularity contests at home. Still, Richelieu was nothing if not focused on the bigger picture. His foreign policy wasn't without its hiccups, though. Take, for instance, the Valtellina affair, a classic case of ambitious overreach. In 1624, Richelieu attempted to seize control of the Valtellina, a key Alpine pass, crucial for controlling movement between France and Italy. The plan was to disrupt Spanish supply lines, but it turned into a diplomatic quagmire. The Pope, no fan of French meddling in his backyard, was none too pleased, and the whole affair nearly derailed Richelieu's plans for a broader anti-Habsburg coalition. It was a blunder that underscored the delicate balance Richelieu had to maintain between expansionist ambitions and the need to keep powerful friends happy, or at least not outright hostile. Despite such setbacks, Richelieu's foreign policy acumen shone in his ability to walk the tightrope between seemingly contradictory alliances. He managed to keep France relatively unscathed while the rest of Europe was tearing itself apart. One of his most audacious moves was to support the Swedish king, Gustavus Adolphus, in his campaigns against the Habsburgs, and yes, you heard that right, a Catholic cardinal bankrolling a Protestant king. It was a strategic gamble that paid off handsomely, as Gustavus's victories diverted Habsburg resources and attention away from French borders. The economic implications of these maneuvers were significant. War might be hell, but it also stimulated economic activity. The demand for armaments, supplies, and logistics created a bustling wartime economy. Richelieu's policies ensured that French industries were well positioned to meet these demands, turning war into an engine of economic growth. However, this was a double-edged sword. The benefits of this wartime economy were not evenly distributed, leading to increased social tensions and unrest, a fact not lost on Richelieu, who had to constantly balance the scales of power and public dissent. In the midst of all this, Richelieu's diplomatic correspondence was a thing of beauty. If you're into intricate webs of alliances and veiled threats, his letters, preserved in archives, reveal a mind working tirelessly to outmaneuver rivals and secure France's place at the top of the European hierarchy. One can't help but admire the sheer audacity of a man who could write to both allies and adversaries with the same cool detachment, all while orchestrating a complex symphony of military and diplomatic moves. Yet for all his successes, Richelieu's foreign policy wasn't without its detractors. Critics accused him of being too focused on military solutions at the expense of domestic tranquility. His infamous reputation as the Red Eminence was partly due to his willingness to employ ruthless methods abroad, mirroring his domestic strategies. But Richelieu was nothing if not consistent. He believed that the ends justified the means, and his ultimate goal was a strong, centralized French state. The 30 Years' War, with its shifting alliances and devastating toll, was a crucible in which Richelieu's diplomatic prowess was both tested and honed. His ability to navigate this turbulent landscape was a testament to his skill as a statesman. He was not just playing the game, he was redefining the rules, ensuring that France emerged not just intact but ascendant. His legacy, however, was a tapestry of contradictions, an intricate blend of visionary leadership and controversial tactics. As Richelieu's story unfolds, his diplomatic legacy continues to cast a long shadow over European history. His strategies laid the groundwork for France's rise as a dominant power, a feat that would reach its zenith under his successor, Cardinal Mazarin, and later Louis XIV. But that's a tale for another day. For now, we leave Richelieu at the height of his diplomatic prowess, a master of the art of intrigue, his eyes ever focused on securing France's place in the sun. Stay tuned for the next chapter as we delve deeper into the machinations of one of history's most enigmatic statesmen. Richelieu might have been the maestro of political intrigue and warfare, but the man had a surprisingly artistic side too. When he wasn't busy orchestrating military campaigns or playing diplomatic chess, he was shaping France's cultural landscape like a Renaissance artist with a blank canvas. It's time to dive into the softer, yet no less strategic, side of Richelieu. The side that founded the Académie Française and patronized the arts, all while playing a long game to cement royal power. Let's start with the Académie Française, the linguistic bodyguard of the French language. Founded in 1635 under Richelieu's watchful eye, the Academy was his brainchild, designed to standardize French and make sure it sounded as sophisticated as he dressed. Richelieu envisioned the Academy as a cultural fortress, a way to unify and elevate the French tongue amid the cacophony of regional dialects and foreign influences. He wanted French to be the language of diplomacy, literature, and, naturally, power. And let's be real, in Richelieu's world, language was just another weapon in his vast arsenal. Now, before you picture Richelieu in a beret, sipping espresso while discussing poesy, let's clarify, this wasn't just about cultural enrichment for its own sake. Richelieu knew that a standardized language was a tool for consolidating power, much like his military campaigns. A unified language meant a unified nation, and a unified nation meant a more controllable populace. It was linguistic centralization at its finest, and it worked. Today, the Académie Française still stands as a testament to Richelieu's foresight, though it occasionally raises eyebrows with its strict guardianship of the French lexicon. Le weekend? Anyone? But Richelieu's cultural impact didn't stop at language. He was a voracious patron of the arts, a man who understood that art and architecture were not just beautiful distractions, but potent symbols of power. Take the Palais Cardinal, later known as the Palais Royal, for example. Richelieu transformed this architectural marvel into a hub of political and cultural life. The palace was a statement piece, a grandiose embodiment of his influence. Costing an eye-watering sum of over 2 million livres, it was adorned with statues and paintings that screamed both opulence and authority. It was less a home and more a fortress of culture, a place where allegiances were forged and the art of governance was as meticulously crafted as the ceilings. Richelieu's patronage extended beyond bricks and mortar. He was a supporter of playwrights and poets, recognizing that the arts were a potent way to sway public opinion and bolster the monarchy's image. He funded the likes of Pierre Corneille, whose plays often depicted themes of heroism and loyalty, key narratives that Richelieu was keen to promote. In Richelieu's France, the theatre was as much a stage for political propaganda as it was for comedy and tragedy. But let's not romanticize Richelieu's artistic endeavors without acknowledging the underlying pragmatism. His patronage was not the altruistic pursuit of beauty, but a calculated effort to wield culture as a tool of statecraft. He understood that a vibrant cultural scene could distract from the political machinations happening behind the curtain. It was a classic case of bread and circuses, with the added bonus that the bread was often a well-crafted sonnet or a striking fresco. Amidst this cultural renaissance, Richelieu's personal relationships were as complex as his political strategies. Take his enduring rivalry with Anne of Austria, the Queen Consort, and Louis XIII's wife. Their relationship was the 17th-century version of a celebrity feud, complete with mutual disdain and strategic alliances. Anne, a Habsburg by birth, was naturally suspicious of Richelieu, who was always one step away from undermining her family's influence. Their sparring was legendary. Imagine a chess match where each player occasionally throws the board out the window. Richelieu, ever the tactician, kept a wary eye on Anne, suspecting her of plotting against him. Anne, on the other hand, never missed a chance to undermine Richelieu's authority. Their rivalry wasn't just personal, it was a microcosm of the larger power struggles that defined the era. Yet, even amidst the tension, there were moments of begrudging respect. After all, it takes a formidable opponent to keep pace with a mind as sharp as Richelieu's. Of course, the romantic appeal of their rivalry cannot be overstated. History loves a good feud, especially one involving power, politics, and the occasional clandestine correspondence. But strip away the drama, and you're left with two individuals locked in a high-stakes game where every move had implications for the balance of power in France. It was a rivalry as much about political survival as it was about personal vendettas. In Richelieu's world, culture and politics were two sides of the same coin. His contributions to the arts were not isolated acts of patronage, but integral elements of his grand strategy to fortify royal power. The Académie Française, the Palais Cardinal, and his support of the arts were all part of a carefully crafted narrative that intertwined cultural romance with political reality. Richelieu was not merely a statesman or a cardinal, he was an architect of modern France, his legacy etched in stone and verse. As we close this chapter on Richelieu's cultural legacy, it's clear that his influence extended far beyond the battlefield and the council chamber. He was a man who understood that power was not just seized but cultivated, in theatres and academies as much as in palaces and parliaments. His story is one of complexity and contradiction, where the pursuit of beauty was as strategic as any military campaign. And with that, our journey through Richelieu's multifaceted legacy is far from over. Next, we'll delve into how his domestic and foreign policies continued to shape France, setting the stage for future generations. Stay tuned as the intrigue and influence of Cardinal Richelieu continue to unfold. As Richelieu's story barrels toward its grand finale, the sun is setting on his era, not with a whimper, but a defiant blaze. By the late 1630s, Richelieu was no longer just pulling the strings. He was the puppet master of France, yet even a master strategist like him couldn't outmaneuver the march of time. His health was in decline, and those migraine headaches that had been his lifelong companions were now joined by tuberculosis. It's as if his body was finally rebelling against the relentless pace he'd forced upon it. Despite his failing health, Richelieu was not about to coast gently into that good night. His mind remained razor-sharp, slicing through the political landscape like a well-honed blade. In his final years, Richelieu focused on fortifying the centralized power structure he had meticulously built. He knew that securing the future meant ensuring a smooth transition of power, and that meant grooming young Louis XIV to take the reins of an absolute monarchy. Richelieu's death in 1642 was not just a personal loss, but a seismic event for France. He had been the architect behind the scenes, and many wondered if the edifice would crumble without its cornerstone. Yet Richelieu was nothing if not a planner. His protégé, Cardinal Mazarin, was poised to step into his red shoes, because let's face it, filling Richelieu's shoes was a task fit only for another cardinal. Mazarin had been Richelieu's right-hand man, absorbing his mentor's lessons in statecraft and diplomacy like a sponge. As Richelieu's body was laid to rest in the chapel of the Sorbonne, the myths and legends surrounding him began to grow like ivy. Was he a ruthless villain, a Machiavellian figure who would stop at nothing to achieve his ends? Or was he a visionary, a statesman who saw beyond the horizon and laid the groundwork for a modern nation-state? The truth, as always, is a tangle of both. Richelieu's centralization of power was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it quelled the noble uprisings and religious strife that had once threatened to rend France apart like a piece of poorly sewn fabric. On the other hand, it laid the foundation for an absolutism that would flourish under Louis XIV, who'd later declare, "L'État, c'est moi." The state is me. This kind of centralized power was a powerful engine, but it was also a fragile machine, prone to overheating and breaking down without careful maintenance. Richelieu's policies had planted the seeds for both the glory and the excesses of the French monarchy. The economic implications of Richelieu's legacy were profound. His reforms had tightened the fiscal screws, ensuring a steady flow of revenue into the royal coffers. Yet this came at a cost. Taxation, particularly in wartime, was a burden that fell heavily on the peasantry, and social unrest simmered beneath the surface like a pot on the verge of boiling over. Richelieu's successors would have to deal with the consequences of a populace that was growing increasingly weary of bearing the economic brunt of endless wars and grandiose projects. In the international arena, Richelieu's diplomatic manoeuvres had reshaped the European balance of power. France emerged from the 30 Years' War not just intact but ascendant, a dominant force on the continent. Richelieu's alliances, though sometimes unconventional, had paid off. By curtailing Habsburg influence, he had created a geopolitical landscape where France could thrive. This was no small feat, considering that Europe was essentially a chessboard where every move could trigger a cascade of reactions. Yet, for all his achievements, Richelieu remains a figure shrouded in myth. The tales of his cunning and ruthlessness have been embroidered by history, turning him into a larger-than-life character. But strip away the legends, and you find a man of contradictions, driven by both ambition and a genuine desire to stabilize his country. He was as much a product of his time as he was a shaper of it, navigating a world where power was the ultimate currency and the stakes were nothing less than the survival of the state. In conclusion, Richelieu's legacy is a testament to the complexities of power and the intricacies of human nature. His policies and strategies have left an indelible mark on the fabric of French history, illustrating how one man's vision can alter the trajectory of a nation. The narrative of his life serves as a reminder that history is not written in black and white, but in shades of grey, where the lines between hero and villain often blur. Richelieu's France was a tapestry woven from threads of ambition, innovation, and sometimes ruthless pragmatism. As the curtain falls on his story, we're left to ponder the echoes of his influence, a legacy that continues to resonate in the corridors of power and in the annals of history. Cold hits you like a freight train as you crack open your eyes in the 17th century Arctic. Forget your modern thermostat and cozy duvet. Your world is wrapped in layers of caribou and sealskin, the sartorial masterpiece of survival engineering. Your outfit isn't just about fashion, it's life or death out here, where temperatures can plummet to a bone-chilling 40 degrees. These garments are a testament to Inuit ingenuity, crafted with meticulous care to trap heat and repel moisture. Caribou fur, with its hollow hair fibers, offers insulation that would make any modern winter coat blush. Meanwhile, sealskin provides a waterproof barrier against the relentless snow and ice. It's functional, sure, but it's also a deep nod to the Inuits' profound relationship with their environment, a bond forged through necessity and honed by centuries of adaptation. As you emerge from your igloo, a marvel in itself with its perfectly arched blocks of snow, you're greeted by a scene that's both unyielding and mesmerizing. The sun's barely peeking over the horizon, casting a pale glow over the frozen landscape. But there's no time for poetic musings. There's work to be done. You're part of a community here, and every member has a role to play, a piece in the complex puzzle of survival. The morning routine kicks off with a quick check of your dog sled, trusty companions in this vast white wilderness. These dogs are more than pets. They're your lifeline, crucial for transporting goods and people across the icy expanse. Each husky has its own personality and pecking order, a canine hierarchy that mirrors the human social structure of your community. Before you embark on today's gathering mission, you take a moment to appreciate the intricate web of roles that keeps your society ticking. From hunters who brave the elements to bring back seals and caribou, to the elders whose wisdom guides decisions, everyone's contribution is vital. It's a collective effort, a survival strategy that's as much about sharing knowledge as it is about sharing resources. As you prepare to set out, you can't help but marvel at the sheer resilience and resourcefulness that define your people. The Arctic isn't just a backdrop, it's a character in your story, one that demands respect and ingenuity. You might romanticize the idea of living in harmony with nature, but the reality is a constant battle against the elements, a never-ending dance of adaptation and resilience. Romanticize it all you want, but the Arctic doesn't care about your poetic notions. It's indifferent, relentless, and yet, in its own stark way, breathtakingly beautiful. As you harness your sled dogs, ready to glide across the frozen expanse, you're reminded that every day is a new challenge, a fresh opportunity to demonstrate the ingenuity and grit that have allowed your people to thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. It's a testament to human adaptability, a story etched in ice and tradition. Sliding onto your sled, you set off across the Arctic expanse, a scene that's more Mad Max than Little House on the Prairie. The frozen landscape might seem like a barren wasteland, but beneath this icy crust lies a treasure trove of edibles, waiting for the savvy gatherer to, quite literally, unearth them. It's time to talk about the unsung heroes of Inuit survival, berries and edible plants. Sure, they don't have the Hollywood glamour of a seal hunt, but in the grand theatre of survival they play a vital supporting role. Now, I know what you're thinking. Arctic plants? Really? Believe it or not, these little guys pack a punch. Take the humble crowberry, for example. While it won't win any taste tests against your favorite smoothie ingredient, it holds up well in the nutritional department. Rich in vitamin C, these berries were like nature's own little multivitamin. And let's face it, scurvy is not a good look on anyone. In a diet dominated by meat, and I mean dominated like a 90-10 split, you need that vitamin boost to keep things ticking along. But it wasn't just about personal health. The economics of gathering was a community affair. Imagine you're a 17th century Inuit. You don't have a nifty app to track your calorie intake. Instead, you're part of a barter system where the nutritional value of what you gather is currency. A bundle of fresh berries might be swapped for a portion of seal meat or a new pair of mittens. The exchange rate wasn't set in stone, but it was driven by necessity. You know, the original supply and demand. The seasons dictated everything. Winter wasn't just when you bundled up like a marshmallow, it was a time to strategize. When the snow melted and the tundra blushed green, it was game on. You had a limited window to gather, and gather you did. It was an all-hands-on-deck kind of scenario. While hunters chased seals, gatherers scoured the land for anything edible. Cooperation wasn't just a nice-to-have, it was a survival requirement. What's fascinating is how the Inuit viewed these plants. To modern eyes, they might seem like a garnish, but to the Inuit, they were lifesavers. They understood that in this harsh world, every calorie counted. The Inuit were masters of balance, knowing just how much to take without tipping the ecological scales. It's a lesson in sustainability that even the most woke among us might envy. Here's a myth-busting nugget for you, the romantic notion of Inuit life as a seamless harmony with nature. Yes, there was respect, but let's not kid ourselves, it was also about survival. The Arctic didn't leave room for sentimentality. You used every part of the plant, knew when and where each grew best, and timed your gathering expeditions like you were planning a military operation. Let's talk about the barter system. Forget about coins and credit cards. This was an economy built on trust and necessity. You couldn't just pop down to the market, you needed to know who had what and when. If you had a surplus of berries, you might trade them for a new tool or some dried fish. It was a system that required constant communication and negotiation skills that would make any modern diplomat proud. Inuit society thrived on this intricate web of exchanges. It wasn't just about food, it was about maintaining relationships and ensuring everyone had what they needed to make it through the lean times. Everyone had skin in the game, literally and figuratively. This wasn't a free market, it was a community-driven effort, where the welfare of the group took precedence over individual gain. The seasonal cycles dictated the rhythm of life. You didn't just gather on a whim, you planned, you strategized. You knew the best spots for certain plants, the right tools to use, and the best ways to preserve your bounty for the long, dark winter months. Preservation methods included drying and fermenting, turning your summer's work into a winter's lifeline. But let's not forget the romanticized view of this lifestyle. The idea of living off the land, of being one with nature. It's appealing, isn't it? Yet the reality was far from idyllic. It was a continuous balancing act, a relentless battle against the elements and the ever-looming spectre of scarcity. And yet there's something undeniably captivating about it all. This was a society that adapted to its environment with a deftness that's almost poetic. The Inuit didn't just survive in the Arctic, they thrived. They crafted a life that was as much about ingenuity and cooperation as it was about grit and determination. As you glide across the frozen tundra, the wind biting at your face, you can't help but feel a sense of awe. This is a world that demands respect, where every day is a new chapter in a story of survival and adaptation. As we continue this journey into the life of a 17th century Inuit, remember that the Arctic isn't just a backdrop, it's a character in its own right, shaping lives and dictating destinies in ways both harsh and beautiful. Stay with me as we delve deeper into this icy saga, where each twist and turn reveals more about the extraordinary resilience of the Inuit people. Now, as midday sneaks up on you like a stealthy Arctic fox, let's dive into the political and social intricacies of Inuit society in the 17th century, a time when decision-making wasn't just a top-down affair, but rather a community-driven exercise in collective wisdom. Forget the idea of a lone chief barking orders. Inuit governance was more akin to a round table of seasoned strategists, where the elders, with their impressive track records of surviving life's icy curveballs, played a pivotal role. You see, in a world where survival was the ultimate KPI, elders were the walking Wikipedia of their time. Their knowledge wasn't just about what plant to munch on or how to avoid becoming polar bear breakfast. It was a living archive of stories and experiences, each tale a page in the community's unwritten rulebook. These stories weren't just for entertainment, though. Let's be real. Who wouldn't want a fireside tale to distract from the frostbite? They were crucial lessons in survival, ethics, and the do's and don'ts of Arctic living. Now, here's a twist. Storytelling wasn't just the Netflix of the day. It was a way to pass down complex social norms and laws without, the inconvenience of paper and ink. Through these narratives, the Inuit could convey the nuances of their social structure, which, contrary to the noble savage stereotype, was anything but simple. This myth, as appealing as a warm igloo on a blizzardy night, paints indigenous peoples as untouched by the complexities of civilization. But the Inuit, with their intricate alliances and social contracts, were far from the simplistic caricatures often portrayed in Western lore. Let's talk alliances. In a world where your nearest neighbor might be a day's dog sled ride away, relationships were your insurance policy. Marriages, trades, and shared hunts were the glue that held these communities together, creating a network of mutual obligation and support that was more robust than a sealskin parka. This wasn't just about keeping your friends close, although that helped when you needed someone to share the last of the whale blubber. It was about survival. If you think networking is just for LinkedIn, think again. These folks were the OG networkers, brokering deals and crafting alliances with the deftness of a modern diplomat. Now, the elders weren't handing out orders like Arctic Santa Claus, but their opinions carried weight. Decision-making was often a group affair, with consensus being the name of the game. You might cringe at the thought of endless meetings, but in a society where every choice could mean the difference between a full belly or a long, hungry winter, this communal approach was necessary. It ensured that decisions were made not just for today, but with an eye on the long game, sustainability, before it was a buzzword. Let's debunk another myth while we're at it, the idea that the Inuit were some monolithic culture living in a homogeneous icescape. In reality, their societies were as diverse as the snowflakes that blanketed their world. Different groups had their own dialects, traditions, and survival strategies, each adapted to their specific environment. From the whale-hunting communities of the Bering Strait to the caribou-chasing bands inland, the Inuit were masters at tailoring their way of life to the resources available. So, where does storytelling fit into all this? Think of it as the social media of the 17th century, minus the trolls and cat memes. Stories were a way to preserve history, to pass down the knowledge of past mistakes and triumphs. They were a binding force, a way to maintain the collective memory of the community. And in an environment where forgetting could mean a very cold, very final end, remembering was a matter of life and death. But let's not romanticize too much. While the stories are rich and the elders wise, the Arctic was still a place where nature didn't give a seal's tail about your plans. The myth of the noble savage glosses over the harsh reality of life in such an unforgiving place. The Inuit weren't living in some idyllic harmony with nature. They were in a constant negotiation with it, a dance of give and take where the stakes were survival itself. As you glide across the tundra, the midday sun casting long shadows on the snow, it's clear that the political and social structures of the Inuit were as complex and layered as the landscape itself. Their world was one of balance and adaptation, where every decision was weighed carefully, and every story told was another thread in the rich tapestry of their history. And as the sun dips lower, promising another bone-chilling night, you can't help but marvel at the resilience and ingenuity of a people who didn't just survive the Arctic, they thrived in it. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the fascinating layers of Inuit life, where each revelation is as unexpected as the Arctic itself. And as the sun dips lower, promising another bone-chilling night, you can't help but marvel at the resilience and ingenuity of a people who didn't just survive the Arctic, they thrived in it. Speaking of thriving, let's dive into the ingenious toolkit that allowed the Inuit to not just exist, but excel in this frozen world. Forget any notion you might have of primitive technology. The Inuit were the MacGyvers of their day, crafting tools with the kind of resourcefulness that would make Swiss Army knives look like kids' toys. First up, let's talk about the ulu. This isn't just a knife, it's the Swiss Army knife's cooler, older cousin. The ulu is a multi-purpose tool with a curved blade, perfect for everything from skinning seals to slicing through tough whale blubber. This half-moon marvel was typically made from slate or bone, with handles often crafted from driftwood, caribou antler, or even walrus ivory. The ulu's design hasn't changed much in centuries, and for good reason. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. This tool was as indispensable to an Inuit gatherer as a smartphone is to a modern commuter, except it never needed an upgrade or new software. But it wasn't just about cutting things up. The Inuit had a tool for every occasion. Take the snow knife, for instance. Made from bone or antler, this was the go-to gadget for slicing and shaping snow blocks to build igloos. You might think snow is just snow, but the Inuit knew better. They understood the subtle nuances between different types of snow, how some packed better for building, while others were ideal for insulation. It's a level of expertise that would make any meteorologist proud. And when it came to building, precision was key. The blocks had to be just right, or else your cozy igloo could turn into a soggy mess at the first sign of a thaw. Now, let's bust a myth about Inuit technology being rudimentary. Sure, they didn't have electricity or combustion engines, but they didn't need them. Their innovations were perfectly suited to their environment. Take snow goggles, for example. Forget designer shades, these were the original eye savers. Made from driftwood, bone, or even ivory, they had narrow slits that reduced glare from the sun reflecting off the snow. It's a design so effective that it inspired modern sunglasses. Who knew? The 17th century Inuit were the trendsetters of UV protection. And speaking of trendsetting, let's chat about transportation. The dog sled wasn't just a way to get from A to B, it was an essential part of daily life. But here's the kicker. The Inuit didn't just domesticate any old dog. They bred huskies specifically for their endurance and ability to withstand the biting cold. Each sled was a masterpiece of engineering, crafted from driftwood or whalebone and lashed together with sealskin. The harnesses, made from walrus hide. It was a system that combined strength, speed, and reliability. And in an environment where getting stuck could mean the difference between life and death, that reliability was non-negotiable. Now, for a little economic context, you might think of these tools as just personal belongings, but they were much more. They were currency, status symbols, and heirlooms all rolled into one. A well-crafted ulu could be worth its weight in seal meat, an essential form of barter in a society where coins were as useful as a chocolate teapot. Tools were passed down through generations, each one carrying the stories and skills of its previous owners. It was a legacy of innovation and adaptability, a testament to the Inuits' ability to make the most out of what little they had. But let's not romanticize this too much. The Arctic environment was brutally indifferent to human endeavor. A single mistake, a poorly constructed igloo, a cracked sled runner could lead to disaster. The reality was a constant battle against the elements, where the stakes were always high. Yet, the Inuit didn't just endure, they innovated, transforming their harsh environment into a home. So, as we consider the tools and techniques of the Inuit, let's drop the primitive label. They were anything but. Instead, see them as masters of their craft, artisans who understood that true success lay in the details. Each tool was a piece of art, each technique a symphony of practicality and survival instinct. The Inuits' approach to technology was less about conquering nature and more about working in concert with it. A lesson in adaptability that even the most tech-savvy among us could stand to learn. As we press on through this icy saga, remember that every snowflake has a story, every tool a tale of human ingenuity. The Inuit didn't just survive the Arctic, they created a life that was as rich and complex as the landscape that surrounded them. Stay with me as we continue to peel back the layers of this remarkable culture, where each new discovery is a testament to the enduring spirit of humanity. As the sun dips below the icy horizon, casting its final, feeble grip over the Arctic landscape, it's time for the Inuit gatherers to head back to their community. The day's achievements are tangible, baskets full of crowberries, a sled well-maintained, and, most importantly, the satisfaction of having contributed to the collective survival of the group. It's a rhythm of life that's as relentless as the Arctic wind, yet there's a strange poetry in its predictability. Now, let's set the scene. You and your fellow gatherers make your way back to the igloos, those architectural wonders that defy the elements with silent resilience. The importance of community gatherings is about to unfold, much like the sealskin blankets that will soon keep the chill at bay. It's storytelling time, a practice as ancient as the ice itself and as crucial as the food it follows. Forget your Netflix binge, this is where the real drama unfolds. The fire crackles, casting flickering shadows that dance along the igloo walls, creating an atmosphere ripe for legends and lore. Storytelling among the Inuit isn't just about passing the time until the next day's grind begins. Oh no, these aren't just tales spun to while away the long dark nights. They are the threads that weave together, the fabric of Inuit culture, a living library of shared experiences, survival strategies, and, yes, even the occasional lesson in what not to do when face to face with a walrus. Through these stories, the wisdom of the elders is passed down, ensuring that the hard-earned knowledge of how to navigate this harsh world isn't lost to the ages. The tales are as diverse as the landscape, from epic hunts to encounters with the mysterious spirits that are believed to inhabit the land. And here's where the Inuit worldview gets particularly fascinating. It's deeply spiritual, with a reverence for nature that's intertwined with a belief in spirits that inhabit every rock, every stream, every living creature. This isn't just about seeing faces in the clouds, it's a deeply held conviction that the natural world is alive with entities that must be respected and appeased. Take Sedna, for example, the sea goddess who lives beneath the ocean waves. According to legend, she controls the animals of the sea and can be both generous and vengeful. If the hunters return empty-handed, it might just be because Sedna is displeased. So, it's not just about having a bad hunting day, it's about maintaining balance and respect in all interactions with nature. These spiritual beliefs aren't just quaint folklore, they are practical guides for living harmoniously within the environment. However, let's not gloss over the harsh realities. The romantic notion of living in tune with nature often ignores the brutal fact that the Arctic doesn't negotiate. It's a place where survival can be razor thin, and where the spirits revered in stories are also reminders of the unpredictable forces of nature. The stories told around the fire are both a comfort and a caution, a way to instill the necessary respect and fear for the environment that can turn from friend to foe in the blink of an eye. As we move into modern times, you might wonder how these traditions have fared in the face of rapid change and globalization. The truth is, while much has evolved, the core principles remain remarkably resilient. Many Inuit communities today continue to practice storytelling, albeit with new narratives that reflect contemporary challenges. The spiritual beliefs, too, have adapted, often blending traditional views with modern religious practices. It's a testament to the adaptability and strength of Inuit culture that these ancient traditions continue to thrive, offering a sense of identity and continuity in an ever-changing world. So, as you sit by the fire, listening to stories that echo with the voices of generations long past, you're reminded that the Inuit way of life is not just a relic of history. It's a living, breathing testament to human resilience and ingenuity. It's about more than just surviving in one of the planet's most inhospitable regions. It's about thriving, about crafting a life that respects the past while embracing the future. The stories, the spirits, the sheer determination. They all paint a picture of a people who have not merely endured, but have flourished against all odds. As the firelight begins to dim and the stories come to a close, there's a moment of quiet reflection. The day's work is done, and tomorrow will bring new challenges. But for now, there's comfort in the shared warmth and the shared history. The Inuit have shown us that true strength lies not in conquering nature, but in understanding and cooperating with it. It's a lesson as relevant today as it was in the 17th century. A timeless reminder of the power of community, the importance of tradition, and the unyielding spirit of the people who have always known how to turn the harshest of environments into a home.